Last winter, I went on a trip to see a few friends from college. The drive over was 18 hours, so I did it in two 9-ish hour sections, staying at an Airbnb on the way. It was the same thing on the way back too, but I'd booked a different Airbnb just for fun. I guess I thought it would be nice to see some different areas and whatnot. Anyway, a bit of heavy snow had caused some delays, and I didn't arrive in town until 9 p.m. It was a very small area, which I was already aware of because there were pretty much no big towns or cities at the halfway point of this 18-hour drive. The last Airbnb had been in a small town as well, but this one was noticeably much smaller. A few stores bordered the road, but all the houses were either on farms or super far apart from each other. When I got to my Airbnb, it was no different. It was super far from the other houses. However, the outside was somewhat modernized. It clearly had some cabin-style features, but it almost looked out of place compared to all the other houses in the area. I parked on the gravel driveway and went up to the door, putting in the code and going inside the house. I'd seen the pictures of the inside online, and it looked to be about the same. I went around and checked all the rooms, then put my things in the bedroom. I then went down to the couch. As soon as I sat down and picked up the TV remote, I began to hear a tapping noise coming from right behind me. I quickly turned my head around and saw a woman standing outside the window, tapping on the glass. Her hair was unkempt and long, and she had a crazy sort of look in her eyes. Once she got my attention, though, she pointed toward the front door and walked away from the window. I got up with my heart racing from the unexpectedness of this all. I made my way over to the door, knowing it was probably just some old lady. I didn't exactly feel scared, but I wasn't feeling safe either, if that makes any sense. I cracked the door open just enough to talk to her. The woman smiled and said she needed some assistance. I waited for a moment for her to explain what was going on. But after a while, she still hadn't said anything. I asked what exactly she needed help with. She looked behind herself, saying she had lost something in the road just outside the house. I looked out there, not being able to see anything past the low lights of the Airbnb. "I'm not really sure if I can help you with that," I said. Her smile immediately left her face, and then she repeated herself like a robot. The entire thing, too, word for word about her losing something out on the road. "Yeah, I know, but I don't think I can help. I'm sorry," I said. I closed the door and waited for a minute until I could hear her leave, then went back to the couch. I wasn't sure if she was just some crazy old lady, or if there was something more nefarious going on, but it was very strange. I relaxed a bit and turned on the TV, watching some shows until 11 p.m. At that point, I got tired and climbed into bed. I think I still felt a bit uncomfortable though, because I found it very hard to fall asleep. All I remember is laying in bed restless for a whole hour. I was abruptly woken up sometime in the middle of the night to a sound coming from the front of the house. It was quiet, but with the rest of the house being completely silent, it really stood out. My mind immediately went to that woman from earlier. I got up from the bed and nervously walked down the hallway, then looked at where I was hearing this from, the front door. I rushed over to stop them, but the door had opened just as I got my body against it. I pressed all my weight into the door, as whoever was on the other side seemed to try and do the same. I'm a pretty big guy, so whoever was out there must have had a fair deal of strength. For a moment, it felt like they might actually overpower me and force the door open. They gave up after a few seconds of pushing, though, and sprinted down the driveway. I locked the door and ran to the window, trying to get a good view of who was out there, but they were already past the line of light. I thought through my options for a second, then ran to grab my things from my bedroom and went out to my car. I drove away. I didn't want to be at that house any longer. I knew police in a small town like that wouldn't be helpful at all. I don't know who was behind that door, but I'm sure they had to have been associated with the woman from earlier that night. If I had went out to help her, or if I had woken up even a moment later, I don't think I would have been seen again after that night. Frankensteins, Draculas, zombies, mummies, and many more were all on the dance floor. The whole club was practically full of monsters because it was Halloween night. One of my friends had asked me to go clubbing with her. Everyone was dressed up in their costumes and the music was blasting out of the speakers. Everyone was enjoying themselves and the festivities of the night. It was a strange sight to see all these creeps and ghouls flirting and dancing casually. I came to the club dressed up as a witch, but since I'm quite a shy person, I was spending most of the night up against the wall sipping on my drink and watching my friends dance. Just as I was about to start regretting my decision to come there, a guy in a costume approached me. He was dressed up like the Grim Reaper. He wore a jet black hooded robe and had this bony white skull mask on that really stood out. This Grim Reaper grabbed my hand, and I noticed his hand was abnormally cold. He pulled me as if to try and escort me somewhere. Since I was alone, I figured I might as well try and join in on the fun at least. If I followed, it would be more exciting than standing alone all night. We weaved in and out of the people dancing on the dance floor. At that moment, someone grabbed my other hand and shouted in my ear, "Hey, don't go with that guy." I spun around to see who it was. As I did so, the Grim Reaper immediately let go of my hand and disappeared amongst the mass of people on the dance floor. The other guy also let go of my hand as well. I didn't realize how cold that first guy's hand had been until he let go. I looked around for that guy, but I couldn't see him anywhere. The next morning, it was reported in the news that some of the residents nearby had found some Halloween costumes strewn about the neighborhood. One of them was the Grim Reaper costume, and there were a couple of others as well. I don't know what was going on with all those people, but I'm sure I wouldn't be around today if I'd followed that guy where he was leading me. He seemed to be taking me towards the outside of the club. I don't know who that person was who stopped me, but I'm very grateful for their assistance. I also don't know why the costumes were randomly abandoned in the neighborhood. Were those other costumes accomplices of that Grim Reaper? Or were they costumes of the people he'd managed to lure outside before me? I have a lot of unanswered questions, and thinking about it gives me chills. I don't think I'll ever have the answers. This happened last October when I was on my way home from a drinking night with my work colleagues. I caught the last train home and arrived at my station right as it came to about 1 a.m. It was Halloween, which was something I didn't particularly care about since we don't really do much for it here in Japan. I live in quite a rural area, so the station was empty, or so I thought. As I walked down towards the ticket gate, I saw a woman in a costume. She seemed a bit too old to be a trick-or-treater, I thought to myself. As I drew closer, I recognized that she was wearing some sort of witch costume. She looked as if she was waiting for someone. At the moment I passed her by, she abruptly called out to me though. "Hey, where do you live?" I continued walking. It was so surreal. I just looked back over my shoulder. She was stood there staring at me. She had long, dark, messy hair, and I remember at the time that only one of her eyes were visible through it. That kind of freaked me out. It was a bit dark in this underground station, and it was an eerie sight to see her standing there. I didn't know how else to explain it. There's no reason to get involved, don't respond, I told myself, as I upped my pace and headed out the exit. It takes about 15 minutes to get home from the station on foot. At that time of night, in my rural area, I knew there would be practically no one out on the streets. It did make me feel a little nervous while I was walking home. I could hear dogs howling in the distance, and my footsteps seemed to echo behind me. It was all adding to this eerie ambiance. I kept looking over my shoulder. When I turned around a corner to see someone stood underneath a streetlight, the silhouette of a woman, I wanted to pass by quickly. Something was really off about tonight. The first time I'd ever felt this way on Halloween. "Where do you live?" a familiar voice asked. Shivers raced up and down my spine. It was that same woman in the Halloween costume from the station. I looked back, and she took a step toward me. I started bolting. I ran, checking over my shoulder. I ran out of breath eventually, and got a real stitch too. Goddamn beers. I had to stop in a dark alleyway to take a break. I looked back behind me, and I couldn't find that woman anywhere. I walked down the alley feeling a bit relieved. "Where do you live?" My heart froze. What the hell was happening? I was shaking. This time I didn't see her at all. I didn't even hear her coming. It sounded as if she was directly above me or something. I spun around in every direction. I was really panicking now. I shut my eyes for a second, and when I opened them, I saw her emerging from behind something, slowly walking toward me. "Where do you live?" Why is this happening to me? My legs were trembling. Even though I was still drunk, I'd never felt fear like that before or since. I didn't know what to do. This lady wouldn't leave me alone, and if I walked all the way home, she would surely find a way to follow me. I pointed to a random house across the street from the alley and blurted out that I lived there. The woman in the costume turned her head slowly toward the house I was pointing at. She then gave a big smile and looked back at me one last time, then back toward the house. With that strange woman now distracted, I took my opportunity to run for it again. I looked over my shoulder to see if she was still following me, but she was just stood still, staring at the house I'd pointed at. She was so creepy. Was this some kind of Halloween prank? I had no idea, but I didn't want to find out. I got home and triple-checked all the doors and windows were locked. I stayed up half the night, watching out the window to see if the woman was out there somewhere. I didn't see her, though. Time went by, but I couldn't forget about that strange experience. I can't really remember her face that well, and my memory's a little bit hazy from being drunk. I still get shivers every now and then when I think about that night. A few weeks after the incident on a Sunday, I was taking a walk with my daughter in the neighborhood. I noticed a moving truck, and the truck was parked right outside the house I'd pointed at that day. I remembered that woman's voice, asking me where I lived. I shuddered. I thought to myself at the time, surely it's a coincidence. The people who lived there were just moving out for something else. But honestly, I wondered if maybe she did something to them that made them want to move out. The owners of the house came out holding boxes and looked exhausted and miserable. Something must have happened there. I could still hear that woman's voice ringing in my head. "Where do you live?" I grabbed my child's hand and started to walk away as fast as I could. I don't go anywhere near that area now, if I can avoid it. A couple of years ago, I moved out of my dorm room and into a new apartment. Of the few pieces of furniture that we had in the dorm, none of it was mine, so I was basically in need of everything. I had more money than I did before, and was planning to save for a few more months before making a bunch of purchases on things for the apartment. There were still a few things I did need right away though. One of these was a bed frame, but they were all really expensive. After buying a new mattress, I was really trying not to drop a whole fat stack of cash on a new frame too. I pulled up a few used furniture sites, but eventually landed on Craigslist as it had the most postings there. A lot of them were really cheap, or even free, but those ones all looked horrible. Then I came across one that didn't look too bad. It was just a plain old wooden bed frame that didn't look too beat up. I sent a quick email asking if it was still available, then went on with my search. About a minute later, I got a reply. The man said it was still available for $35. That was a perfect deal for me. I quickly accepted his offer and we set up a time to meet later that day at 6. While I waited, I unboxed some of my things and moved a bunch of stuff around in the bedroom to make some space for that new frame. At 5:30, the man emailed me his address. It was about 20 minutes away, in an area I hadn't been to yet. Well, I wasn't exactly familiar with anywhere around here too well though, since I'd just moved. I grabbed some cash and headed out. As I drove, I looked around frequently, trying to get myself familiar with what was around me. About halfway there, everything sort of dropped off though. The town I was in very quickly ended, and the area became a lot less populated, with buildings or houses. It was not what I'd expected. As I got to the neighborhood this house was supposed to be in though, I felt a little bit better. The houses weren't too far apart, and it did look mostly normal. However, they were definitely not nice-looking houses. I pulled up to the address and parked in the driveway. The lights were on and the front door had been left open. I got out and walked up, ringing the doorbell. The man came a moment later. He was tall and heavy, wearing a hat and jacket. He invited me inside. The man didn't look strange in any way, but something about him made me feel weird. It was just the way he talked, I guess, kinda like we'd been buddies for years now. I followed him upstairs and down the hallway that led to a small bedroom. We stepped into the room, and I was immediately confused. The room was occupied with a dresser, nightstand, and even clothes laying around. The bed frame still had a mattress on it, with sheets and blankets as well. I clarified with him that I was only wanting to buy the frame and not the mattress or anything else. He said of course. I looked back over at the bed frame, seeing that it looked fine. I said I'd buy it, and he smiled. He offered to help me drag it out to my truck, but said he'd want a drink before we got to it. The man walked back into the hallway and came back immediately with 2 glasses of beer that he must have been keeping in the next room over. He held one out to me, but I politely declined. The man looked very confused. "Come on, it'll be fun." He acted like we might as well hang out since we were already here. I told him I was really busy that night, and I just wanted to buy the bed frame and get out of there. He was being really pushy though. His smile became noticeably less genuine as he urged me to have a sip of this drink with him. I quickly stepped past him and out into the hallway, not wanting to be cornered into that small room. I told him I was going to leave. I turned to walk out, and he immediately changed his attitude. He started being overly nice, apologizing and asking if I wanted to take the bed frame for free even. I ignored him and began walking faster down the stairs. I heard the man coming after me down the hallway. I was able to get out before he caught up to me, and I saw him standing at the front door as I pulled away. Maybe he was just some lonely guy living out there that wanted a buddy to hang out with, but that was all just a little too strange. I mean, the supposed bed frame and room it was in were clearly in use by someone. When I got home that night, I checked the posting again, but it was deleted. From my memory though, I knew the bed frame was shown by itself with no mattress or anything on it. Now that I thought about it, that made it even stranger that it wasn't like that when I got there, considering his intent had been to sell it. but whatever that man was up to, I didn't like it, so I just got out of there. This happened when I was a student. When I was at university, I was in a club with this girl who was a year younger than me. She really liked me. She was a nice girl and very popular too, and one day she confessed her love to me. Thing is, I liked another girl, so I politely refused her advances. She got really angry. She was so shocked that I'd had the audacity to refuse her. Due to how extreme her reaction actually was, I had to quit going to the club. Life went on and we were getting ready to graduate. My attention turned more towards job hunting. I graduated and I hadn't seen her again in all that time. Truth be told, I'd done my absolute best to avoid her after the way she'd reacted to my rejection. I managed to get a job working in Tokyo, and I started living alone. It was great. After about 3 months or so, I came back from work around midnight. I was trying to make a name for myself, so I was putting in as many hours as I could in my profession. I checked my mailbox, and I found that I had a letter in there that didn't have a stamp on it. I opened it. It was a letter from that girl that had liked me. A lot of old memories from my university days came back up. It was quite nostalgic. It had been a while since then. The letter said this: "I still can't forget about you." The whole thing was written in a tone as if she was still angry when she'd written it. It went on to say more. "You know, I had a hard time finding this place. I came all this way to see you, but you weren't home. You really disappointed me." This was especially creepy, since I'd never given out my address to anyone beside my parents yet. I turned to the next page. There was a drawing of what looked like she and I holding hands. I looked at the drawing. We were smiling and gazing deeply into one another's eyes. It was a fairly well-drawn piece of art, which made it even more creepy. Just to draw it this well from her imagination of me from years ago, that obsession really amazed me. I looked at the hair on the drawing as well. It seemed especially lifelike. When I touched it, I was surprised to find that there was real hair glued to the paper. She had glued each strand so carefully that I hadn't even noticed it wasn't drawn at first. If I had to hazard a guess, I would think that it was her hair. I'm in the process of moving now, but even if I move, I wonder if she'll somehow be able to track me down again. I find myself thinking often these days, what would have happened if I was home that night? Would she have confronted me? What would she have done to me? It really creeps me out. Don't worry though, guys. I keep checking my doors and windows to make sure they're shut and locked. These days, I am a bit freaked out every time I leave the house though. I wear one of those face masks just in case. I don't want her to recognize me instantly. I know it's a bit silly, but I'll let you guys know if anything else happens. But it's really amazing to me just how obsessed some people can be. This happened when I was living at university. I'm a woman, and at the time I was living alone. I was living in a really small town called Hikashi Kawaguchi. My home phone was ringing, and I answered it. The voice on the other end asked, "Is this Emily? I'm calling from the only hospital in this particular town." We spoke for a while, and this person said they were a doctor who specialized in some sort of medicine. This all came at the time coronavirus was at its peak in Japan. It seemed to be some sort of courtesy call. I was happy enough to listen to this doctor's advice. The only thing was, I'd never heard of this doctor before, and I'd never had an appointment with him either. Usually when a doctor calls or when you call your doctor, they already know all your personal info like your name, your home address, etc. The doctor should have all the information about your last visit as well, right? He asked me a few questions and I confirmed the answers. Everything else seemed to be completely above board. He then asked me to participate in a questionnaire about my personal life. I thought to myself, why not? If it helps people during this pandemic, that can only be a good thing, right? He began to ask me some questions. It was okay at first, but it started to get weird pretty quickly. It began with completely normal, non-offensive, and non-intrusive questions. For example, have you had a cold or cold-like symptoms lately? Have you been to the hospital in the recent past? As he continued on, the line of questioning changed though. What kind of clothes do you like to dress in? What are you currently wearing? Then he asked me, did you know that breast cancer is on an increase at the moment? What cup size are you? That can really be a factor. I refused to answer. I gasped when the doctor then said, I think I'll need to pay you a personal visit. I'll be there in 7 minutes. The phone then hung up. I stood there shocked, gripping my phone. I bolted out the front door and ran to stay with a friend. I stayed there through the whole night. When I went back to my place, I was really glad to see that it hadn't been burgled or anything. I'm an idiot, so I didn't call the police to make a report. The more I thought about that creepy call, though, the more I started to get a bit frightened. This was not some guy trying to get his rocks off. This was not a heavy breather call, not some neck beard either. This guy was methodical. What was extra spooky was the fact that he said he would be at my apartment within 7 minutes. And that really stood out to me. Usually, if people are making things up, they'd say something in a multiple of 5, right? But that was really precise. I checked Google Maps and saw the hospital was over 15 minutes away. It was so weird. I didn't get a call like that again either. That was a bit of a relief, as this had been playing on my mind quite a lot and making me look over my shoulder everywhere I went. As time went by, my feelings of fear towards this guy turned to feelings of anger. I didn't want to live my life scared. My friend suggested that if I really wanted to figure out who that call was from, I should ask the phone company. Well, I called the phone company up, and we found out the call had come from a payphone pretty close by. It was exactly 7 minutes away. Half a year had passed since then. I still had that creepy call in the back of my mind. Then one day, my home phone rang just as I was heading out to work. I picked it up. Hi, I'm from AT&T. This is the cell phone company. We've been trying to get in touch with you. As I understand, there's been a bit of a dip in service in this area. We wanted to get in touch and see if you're experiencing any issues yourself. I was in a rush and didn't really have time for this, so I said that I couldn't help. They then said they would call back at a more convenient time. I told them I wouldn't be free until after 6. Thank you. For callback purposes, could you let me know your cell phone number? I'll call you back after 6 p.m. I was a bit hesitant because of what happened before. Well, why don't you just give me your information, and then I can call you back myself when I get home from work. How about that? The line immediately went dead. Was this happening all over again? When I went to work, I told my boss about what happened, and he decided we should call the cops right now. Whoever was doing this was definitely trying to get to me while I was home alone. I didn't feel safe anymore. I had no idea if I was being watched or what. I flinched every time the doorbell rang. I decided to just move house eventually. I'm pretty sure that I'm safe now, as I've moved quite far away. Maybe the guy from the hospital and the guy from AT&T were the exact same person, but I couldn't really tell by just the voice, since it had been so long between. I've never told this to anyone. This was when I was a little kid. We were at a park with a circular lake. On one end was the parking lot and exit, pretty much where most of the people were. On the other end was nothing but woods, which was a little unsettling because of the contrast. People would often walk around the lake or jog for exercise, so I decided to take a walk too. You know that feeling in public, where it feels like you're alone even though you're not? I felt that way when I got to the lonely forested end of the lake. I went to turn around and happened to glance at the woods for a moment. I shit you not, I saw the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. Picture this. A thick, hollow log on the ground, blending in with the forest floor. As I happened to gaze at the end of that log, I could see a person's face. Their eyes went bug-eyed. They had a big surprised expression, as if I'd just caught them doing something they weren't supposed to be doing. I ran back to my family, and we decided not to go to that park ever again. I was bored one day, so I decided to Google my own name. A bit dumb, really, but hey, we've all done that, haven't we? I found a bunch of pages with my full name on them, maybe 10 or so. It was mainly LinkedIn pages or Facebook profiles, and people with totally different lives to mine, who just so happened to have the same name. Then, though, at the very bottom, I found a mysterious blog. It was called My Full Name's Page. It was a very simple blog page, and didn't look professionally made either, just a private blog type of thing, maybe like a diary or something. It was quite interesting. The person who seemed to be running this blog was about the same age as me, and had the same interests and hobbies as me as well. As I scrolled through this blog, I noticed there were 5 or 6 regular commenters. Nothing special at all. Yet somehow I found myself checking in on this blog from time to time. I was watching for new content. It was kind of like getting full access to someone's diary. One post caught my attention though. It said something like this. It was a hot one today, but it was a great day to watch soccer and see Japan win. It was something like that. I can't exactly remember the wording. What was striking, though, was the fact that it was very similar to what I'd done that day. I'd basically stayed home and watched soccer all day. The admin of the blog must have been in the stadium, of course. I chalked it up to a coincidence, and nothing more at the time. After all, watching soccer is not too specific. That was a very bad move on my part, though. The next day, I checked the blog again. It had another post. Having a bad day today. I made a mistake at work. It was very odd now. I was down that day because I'd made a mistake at work too. Day after day after day, I kept checking that blog, and I kept noticing more and more coincidences and similarities between me and the author, or whoever the admin was. It was like reading a blog about my own life. There was another weird post one day. After work, I bought a CD and ate some curry for dinner in a restaurant. Pretty classic, huh? Okay, now I knew this couldn't be a coincidence, because that's exactly what I did that day. As the days turned to weeks, I started to get paranoid. The owner of the blog began receiving birthday wishes from the few who regularly commented, and yeah, as you might have guessed, they had the same birthday as me. I really should have taken that as a sign to quit looking at that blog, or at least try to do something about it. Instead, my curiosity really got the best of me. I decided to comment myself using a pseudonym. When I went to write, though, I realized that this was a bulletin board, a page that you can't interact with. I didn't understand how the page was having comments then. It was so weird. I wanted to find out what exactly this page was supposed to be about. It was so eerie. I sent an email to the admin. Hey, nice to meet you. I have the same name as you, and I often visit this site. It was a pretty bland email. The next day, I decided to check on that page. I was surprised to find that it had suddenly been deleted. That was pretty creepy. I then went to check my emails. I'd gotten a reply from the admin. All the page said was, "Looks like I found ya." I got the hell out of my apartment and started staying with a friend. I'm thinking about moving soon, and I'll post more if anything else happens. I hope this is all just a prank or something. I was camping out in Colorado a few years ago. During the fall, this camping trip was an impulse decision, as I just felt like going out for the night and spending it in the calming nature. I had walked down a 2-hour trail that led to the spot I set up at. It wasn't a big campground like all the other places were. This was more of a small opening at the very end of a dirt path I'd found a couple years back. Nobody else ever seemed to come here to this area. The forest around the opening was really nice too. Over the years, I'd gotten somewhat used to navigating it without getting lost. On this day, just an hour or so before sunset, I set out on a short walk around the area. Going for walks around this time was always the best, being that the woods are calm and the breeze really starts to roll in. I walked out and around for maybe 20 minutes or so before I saw something just ahead. There was a man walking in the woods just like me. He was crossing in front of me about 60 yards out, so he was pretty far away. He didn't look like he'd even noticed I was there. What was odd though was the way he was walking. He was moving his hands all around and nodding his head back and forth. Although I couldn't hear him, I could see his mouth clearly moving as if he was talking to someone. I waited to see if maybe someone was following behind him, but no, it was just him talking to himself in the middle of the woods. Maybe it wasn't something to get overtly creeped out upon, but I'd never seen anyone out here before, and this man didn't exactly have the appearance of someone normal. After about a minute though, he was gone. I turned back around and went back to my tent, not really feeling comfortable being out in the woods with that guy wandering around. I waited a half an hour, then got a campfire going as the sun was now set. I had a folded chair I was sitting on. I mostly just thought to myself for the next hour, not about anything in particular, but more as a way to clear up my mind. About 2 hours past sunset, I heard something in the distance. I moved away from the crackling fire and a bit closer toward the tree so I could hear it better. It sounded like someone talking or mumbling far out into the woods. Even stranger though, I didn't see a flashlight or any source of light at all. This person was walking out there in the pitch black woods. My stomach dropped, knowing it was extremely unlikely the man from earlier had stumbled across my campsite by accident. I stayed still, listening in and hoping by some chance that he didn't know I was here. Maybe he was just passing by. 30 seconds later, the voice faded away. I wasn't fully convinced this was all just chance though. I covered up most of the campfire, leaving only a small flame burning so it wouldn't create too much light. I then waited and listened. The next hour was unnerving to say the least. I couldn't hear or say anything, but it was the anticipation that kept me feeling uneasy. Then, at what had to be around 11 p.m., footsteps came rushing from directly in front of my campfire. I shot up from my chair and unholstered my pistol. A man I recognized as the one from earlier ran up to the other side of the fire and stopped 10 feet away from me. He wasn't talking anymore, but instead he had a grin. Not an over-the-top smile, but a friendly, neighborly grin. I aimed at him with my gun. He didn't say anything or do anything. He just looked at me. "You walk away right now," I said under my breath, trying to be as intimidating as possible. He looked me in the eyes, then down at my gun. then back at me. His grin faded away quickly. There was a moment where it felt like he was about to do something, but then he just smiled again and walked back off into the woods. I didn't waste any time packing things up with one hand, as I kept my pistol out and aimed. I then left in the opposite direction from where he'd gone. The whole way back, I was so paranoid. I kept thinking I was hearing the man's voice talking to himself again. What was he doing out there, and what was he trying to do to me? It's anyone's best guess. Had I not been prepared, I don't think I would have ever been able to leave those woods at all. I'm 29 years old and a woman, and this happened to me just 3 years ago. Now, I didn't live anywhere near my family at the time, but one of my family members was having something serious going on. I needed to be there for a few months at least. My options for living while there were either a hotel, which would be incredibly expensive, or to rent a place from a private owner. Finding someone who will rent out for only a few months is not exactly an easy task. Most people's absolute minimum is 6 months. I spent multiple full days looking online and basically had no luck at all. That was until I got to Craigslist. I knew there was a renting section on the site, but I was trying to avoid it unless absolutely necessary. Fairly quickly, though, I found a place not too far away from where I actually needed to be. It was a very small house, which hopefully meant much cheaper. They didn't specify a minimum lease period either. There was a phone number on the page, so I called it right away. An older-sounding woman picked up. She talked very slowly, but we had a conversation about the property and pricing. She was kind enough to let me only do a 4-month lease. Fast forward to a few weeks later. I arrived at the property. Again, it was very close to where I needed to be, but it was also very far out of the way from the main city, kind of tucked away into the woods. As we'd previously discussed, the woman didn't meet me there, but had instead left a key and some papers taped to the door. I went inside and took a look around. It was very old and kind of cramped. I did a bit of unpacking, then rested after the long drive. I didn't do much else other than watching TV. Around 7 o'clock, though, there was a knock at the door. I got up and checked my phone. I didn't see any text from the lady saying she was coming over. I walked over and looked out the peephole. There was a random man standing a few feet away from the front of the porch. I opened up the door and called out to him. "Hello, sir? How can I help you?" He had a serious face and explained that he was here for the fireplace cleaning. I looked over at his van that was parked in the driveway, right behind my car, then back at him. "It's a little bit late for that, isn't it? It's almost 7:30. He shrugged and said, "Well, that's what it was scheduled for." I told him to wait a minute, closing the door and walking back to the living room. I texted the lady and tried calling as well. I couldn't get a hold of her though. I then went over to the fireplace. It wasn't dirty at all. I didn't really know what to think. After all, this wasn't my house. Maybe it was just a cleaning service the lady had scheduled as part of prepping the home for me. This might sound odd, but fireplace cleaning is such a niche service that I thought the man likely wasn't lying. If he'd said he was a plumber or something generic, I might have been more skeptical, but it was so specific. I went back. When I opened the door again, the man was now standing right on the porch just a couple feet from me. It really scared me, not expecting him to be so close all of a sudden. Before I could respond or say anything, he told me he was trying to get out on time tonight and really needed to start right now. He stepped closer and put his hand on the door, gently pushing it a bit more open. Now I was getting really uncomfortable and rethinking everything. "Alright, yeah, just give me one more minute and I'll let you." I said that, trying to close the door. but the man kept his left hand on it and kept it open, knowing I couldn't close it if he wasn't going to let me. It seemed I didn't have a choice anymore. I let him in. I walked him over to the fireplace. He followed close behind me. He went up and looked at it only for a second. Right as he turned around, I took my keys from the counter and ran out to my car. The man's heavy footsteps rung throughout the house. I got out and into my car. He ran up to the window just as I turned it on, with his van still right behind me. I had to turn off the driveway and out into the woods, dodging the trees as I made my way back to the pavement. Eventually, I got back to the road. I called the police while driving, too scared to stop. When the officers arrived, he and his van were already gone. The front door was left wide open. It plainly showed he was not supposed to be there. Of what the police and I know, the man probably knew this house was being rented out somehow, and that whoever the new resident was, they wouldn't know if he was actually scheduled to come or not. I guess he was hoping to be let in from there. It's anyone's guess as to what he planned on doing, though. When I was a kid between the ages of 14 to 16, me and my friends were really into hanging out anywhere other than our houses. Most of the time, we would go to some fast food place and chill there, or find some spot in the woods near the park. I guess we were at that age where we wanted to be alone and not have people looking over our shoulders all the time. The only problem with this was that on the weekends when we'd be out late, most stores and dining areas closed before we were ready to call it a night. During winter break one year, we ran into this problem quite a lot. We'd go to the parks to hang out, only to find that even in the late hours of the night, there would be multiple other groups that had the same idea. Then one night, my friend JT brought up his parents' old farmhouse, saying it could be a cool spot to explore, and surely nobody else would be there. He'd mentioned it a few times before this, but we never thought much of it until that night. JT drove me and my other friend Paul out into what looked like the middle of nowhere. We arrived at a wooden fence. The fence was closed off with a chain, since it was private property and JT didn't have the key to it. We parked and hopped over it from the edge of the wooden fence. The first thing I realized was that I couldn't see the farmhouse. Yeah, it was dark out, and there were no lights anywhere, but I couldn't even make out a shape of a house in any direction. JT started walking, leading the way on a rough gravel path. He started to explain why his grandparents even had this place to begin with. He said it was his grandparents' farmhouse, but when they died, they'd passed it down to his parents. Apparently, it was just in really horrible condition, and his parents didn't know what to do with it, so they just kept it that way. That was almost 10 years ago, and nobody had done any maintenance or even checked up on it in over a decade. We walked down this path following JT for a good 10 minutes or so. We finally began to be able to make out a building, or at least the outline of it in the dark. You could tell even from here that it was in really bad shape. The roof was visibly dipping inward, like it was about to collapse at any moment. Some of the siding panels were hanging from the wood. All of us were quiet now, just kind of looking at it as we walked closer. When we got up to the front of the house, the door was covered by a large sheet of wood. We went around to the back, where the door was completely missing altogether. We each turned on our phone flashlights and stepped inside. Surprisingly, the inside wasn't really trashed like we'd thought it would be. Most of the furniture and stuff didn't seem to have been moved very much. It was extremely dusty though. Our phone's lights were not the best, so maybe it looked better than it actually was. We split up, and after a minute of just walking around the first floor, I entered a hallway on the left side of the house. I began walking down that corridor, when suddenly someone walked past the end of the hallway. I froze, and out of panic I called out to JT, wondering if maybe it was him wrapping around or something, but I already knew that couldn't be it. The man I saw in the dark was much taller and thinner than either of my friends. I stepped back and started to go to where I'd last seen the two of them. When I turned around the corner and held up my light, both GT and Paul were standing in the middle of the room, looking away from me. I stepped into the room and looked at what their lights were pointing at. At the edge of the light, the man was standing and staring right back at them. It was like they were all frozen in fear, unsure of what to make of the situation. "Guys, let's leave," I said, trying to act as calm as possible so the guy wouldn't do anything. That must have triggered everyone's reaction at once though, because suddenly we were all sprinting to the back door and running out into the open field. With all the scrambling and footsteps, I can't even say for sure if the man chased us out. JT says he was confident he did though. We pretty much ran straight back to the car and drove off, not taking any more risks. I think we can all assume the man was either a squatter or a homeless person, defending the place he'd come to call home, but without a good look at him, it was hard to say for sure. JT said he'd tell his parents about it so they could lock down the farmhouse, but he never really went through with it. He was worried about getting in trouble for going there. What happened that night remains one of the most horrifying experiences I've had, and if JT was right and the man was trying to chase us out, then we were all really lucky to get out of there unharmed. This was only a year ago. At the time, it had been a while since my last camping trip, and for a few months leading up to this, I was really just wanting to get out and camp like I always used to do. Finally, I had gotten some time off work and planned out a trip right away. There were some mountains not very far, about a 2-hour drive away from me. There were plenty of trails on them. I scrolled through the pictures, but eventually just decided to choose one. Once I got there, I wasn't too worried about the trail itself. I really just wanted to sit by my tent and relax. I drove up the mountain with 4 days worth of camping supplies and food. This wasn't really a popular destination that people came to a lot, so there weren't very many parking areas. I ended up finding a plain dirt lot on the side of the road and just parked there. I then got out and started walking along the road until I got to one of the camping trails. On the very grayed out map, it showed the trail went a few miles into the forest, then up the mountain and split into 3 different paths that all led to various camping spots. I figured this would work, so I started the hike. It took just under 2 hours to get to the 3 paths I'd seen. I saw no difference in any of them, so I just picked the left one at random. About 30 minutes later, I came up to the camping grounds. It was an open area with not that many trees. Nobody else was there, and it didn't look like anyone had been there in a long time either. Everything had grown over, to the point where if there wasn't a direct path leading to this place, it would look just like any other spot in the forest. I tossed my bags down by one of the trees and started building up my camping area. I sat down on a log and made my lunch. After that, I just kinda sat there, writing in my journal and listening to the birds' songs. Once the sun was starting to get lower, I had to get a fire going to keep me warm. I got up and walked around the perimeter of the camping grounds to find sticks to use. Not too far from my tent, though, I found something quite strange. There was a path leading off into the woods. It was clearly not a regular trail, though. This was obviously a footpath, which had been formed by someone walking this same route over and over. Usually these types of paths grow over quickly when not in use, so the fact it was very clear and noticeable was incredibly odd. I finished collecting all the sticks and prepped the campfire, but something about that path there made me feel uneasy. I just wanted to check out what it was really quickly before camping the night right next to it. I grabbed my bag and started following this thin trail. The more I walked on it, the more I was sure someone had been there recently. After a 15-minute journey, I reached the end. Out in the woods just beyond this path, there was a small cabin. It looked like it was decaying and abandoned. The wood was splintering, and entire boards were missing. The door was left wide open. I walked up to it and looked around, wondering why this footpath would lead to this abandoned hut in the woods. It was far too distant for someone to stumble upon it out of curiosity. I peered in through the doorway. It was dark inside, and I couldn't really see much. I could tell that it wasn't empty. There was something inside. I was about to take a step in when a sudden voice behind me startled me. "Go away. Leave right now," a man said, very sternly, almost furious. I turned to face him. Standing about 10 feet away was a man. He told me to leave again. Without saying a word, I did exactly as he said. I walked away. I looked back once more, seeing the man standing at the edge of the path and watching me. I guess to make sure I was really leaving. Once I got back to my tent, it was already dark out, but I was not going to stay there. I quickly packed up and left, dangerously hiking in the pitch black with just a flashlight until I got back to my car. I don't know what was going on there, but what frightened me so much was that I was immediately sure the man I'd seen did not live there. He was wearing perfectly clean clothes, had no equipment, and there was no signs of him being out there for more than a couple of days. That makes me question why he was out there in the first place, and why he needed me to leave so urgently. How did the footpath even form if he didn't live there? Or was there someone else who did that? The whole thing has me asking 100 questions, and I don't think I'll ever get any of the answers. This morning, I'd just gotten out of class and was headed on my way home. At some point, I noticed a crippled old lady begging for help. She told me that she needed to get into her apartment. I helped her and took an elevator and took her to her door. To my surprise, the door was wide open when I got there. As I went inside, she asked me if I could go to a nearby shop to buy her wine and some cigarettes. She then proceeded to give me her credit card and keys and insisted that I should leave my bag in her house with her. Of course, I said no thank you. Even though the situation was weird, that wasn't what scared me the most. As I looked around inside the apartment, there were no decorations, no pictures, not anything personally identifiable. It was also disgusting. There was a chair right in the center with some sort of substance on it, and the walls were filled with cracks and what looked like some sort of bodily fluids. I got a bit scared. I took the card and the keys and tried to act like normal. I went to the store, but the woman at the counter said the card wasn't even a real one. It was at this moment I decided not to go back and gave the cards and keys to the police. A friend of mine told me she'd seen the exact same old lady, saying the exact same things to her as she'd told me. The scariest thing was, though, that my friend had seen a man bringing the old lady outside and then immediately going into the apartment to hide. The area where she was found was known for being quite dangerous. I don't know exactly what was going on there, but I definitely think it was a setup or trap of some kind. I think I nearly just died or something. But what do you guys think? I've never really had anything like this happen before, so I'm not sure if perhaps I'm just overthinking it or what. I'm a relatively short girl, which is why I didn't even want to go out and see if this was just a matter of the guy wanting to personally hand over the food. Yesterday at around 5 a.m., my girlfriend had ordered me some DoorDash. We always put the leave at the door option, especially when it's that time of morning. It turns into a matter of just waiting for the dasher to leave. The guy I got yesterday, though, really scared the hell out of me. We had gotten the DoorDash notification that the food had been dropped off and was ready for us to grab. I was just about to walk out the door when I noticed the man was just standing there. He was not on his phone or trying to see if he was at the right house. Nothing. No kind of movement at all. I was a bit confused. I asked my girlfriend if she had remembered to put the leave at door option, and she had. We waited a bit before she decided she'd call and remind him to just leave it there. He never answered. He ignored every call, every text. I even saw him hang up on her after picking up. It wasn't even a matter of stealing my food. If that were the case, he would have just driven off. The man spent a long time waiting. At one point, I was even almost about to go out when I no longer saw him. But I realized he was just a bit further down the street, hiding behind something and waiting. He hadn't even left the food on the fence, just taken it with him to who knows where. After I didn't leave the house, he drove off in a fury, almost like he was upset I didn't go out there. That was around the same time I saw him hang up on my girlfriend. The whole time he waited lasted around 30 minutes. I have no doubt that guy was up to something very nefarious. Four years ago, I lived in a very small one-bedroom house with one of my best friends. We couldn't afford anything bigger, so that's why we settled with a one-bedroom. I slept on the futon in the living room, and my friend slept in the actual bedroom. This happened around fall time, when it was just starting to get cold out. My friend had taken a few days to go visit his sister a few hours away, so I was the only one at the house. This was over the weekend too, so I got to spend both entire days enjoying having the space to myself. It's not that I didn't like having him around, but it was just nice to not be crammed together in a tiny house for once. Anyway, on Sunday night, I went out to pick up some groceries and got home around 7 or so. I had to work the next day, but given the unusual circumstances, I decided to stay up a little bit later and watch a movie. I must have stayed there on the couch for at least an hour, almost finishing the movie up, when there was a quiet thump from just down the hallway. I looked over and didn't really see anything. I figured it was just the house making some noises. I kept on with my movie. For the next 30 minutes, there were no other sounds, so I thought the thump was completely insignificant. It had fully left my mind once the movie was over. I went to fill up my water bottle and went back to the futon, pulling it out into a bed and laying down. I was on my phone for a while and fell asleep sometime around 11 or so. When I woke up, my eyes felt real heavy and my vision was blurry as well. I wasn't sure what had woken me up, but I knew it was sometime late in the night. I rubbed my eyes a bit and looked over at the clock when a very faint sound came from the other side of the house. It was wood creaking, like someone was carefully walking across the floorboards. My eyes widened immediately, and I snapped fully awake. My heart rate started rising. I got off the futon and crept over to the hallway. The creaking had stopped, but looking down that hallway, I got this horrifying feeling. I walked down until I reached the door to my friend's bedroom. I leaned against it and listened in. It was perfectly quiet, not even a sound coming from the house itself. I slowly twisted the door handle and pushed it open a few inches, scanning my eyes across the room. I continued to open the door wider. It looked empty, but I quickly noticed how messy the room was. There were things scattered all around the floor and bed. Confused, I took a step inside and flicked on the light. Instantly, from the corner of my eye, I saw a figure move away from the gap between the closet door. I jumped out of that room and slammed the door shut. I ran to grab my phone. I heard the closet door opening and footsteps going into the hallway. Once I'd grabbed my phone, I ran to the back door. I saw a large man charging down the hallway toward me. I got out and went through the backyard, but the man didn't attempt to follow me outside. A minute later, I got to an area I felt was safe and called the police. They arrived fairly quickly and searched the house, but they ultimately found nothing useful. We couldn't figure out who the man was or why he was even there. They also weren't entirely sure how he'd gotten in the first place. It's likely that he'd broken in while I was away getting groceries that night, but there were no signs of forced entry. My friend was just as terrified as I was once I told him everything. We eventually moved out of the house together. Hopefully, we never have to encounter that man again. Last year, my roommate moved out of the house. We had been renting together for the past 4 years. By then, both of us had gotten better jobs and were getting paid much more. The house we lived in wasn't the best, so it was only a matter of time before one of us moved out to get their own place. After he moved, though, I was able to use more of the space in the house, and actually just decided to stay there for another year or two. This happened during that time, sometime in early December. Our area was going through a week of some pretty bad snowstorms, and the office I worked at allowed us to work from home for a few days, if we wanted to. Obviously, I chose to take them up on that offer. I used my old roommate's bedroom as an office and worked all throughout the day. At one point while I was working, though, there was a knock at the front door. I left the room to check who this was. There was a man on the porch in a heavy winter jacket. He didn't seem to be a worker or a delivery person of any kind, just some regular old Joe. I opened the door, getting hit by a rush of snow and wind. Yeah? How can I help you?" The man smiled and apologized for interrupting my day. He explained his situation. He said his car had gotten stuck in the snow right on the side of the road next to my house, and he didn't have a phone on him. He asked if he could borrow mine to call someone for help. Obviously skeptical, I told him to give me a moment. I then closed my door and went to the other side of the house. I looked out the window at the road he was supposedly stuck on. There was a small SUV out there that looked like it had slidden on some ice onto the curb and gotten stuck in the snowbank. Now that I was pretty sure he was not lying about that, I grabbed a jacket and put on some shoes. Then I went back to the front door. I was still a bit skeptical, of course, but I stood on the porch with him as he used my phone to call his brother, just so that if he tried to run with it or anything, I could chase after him and prevent him from leaving. After a quick call, the man simply handed my phone back and thanked me, then walked away. I went inside and checked out the window, seeing the man getting in his car. Thinking everything had been settled and resolved quite peacefully, I went back to the office and started working again. Around 7 o'clock or so, I felt like I'd done enough for the day and took the rest of the night off. It was then that I remembered about that man in his car from earlier. I went to check and see if he'd gotten the help he needed, and was surprised to find that car was still there. I could see the man moving around inside of it. It had been almost 3 hours by then, which made me wonder how he was still stuck there. Maybe he was waiting for his brother to get off work and pick him up or something? I didn't know. I went to the kitchen and made some dinner, then sat down on the couch to watch some TV. I stayed up until about 9:30, then went upstairs to shower and get ready for bed. I turned the water on and hopped in the shower, but after a few minutes, there was a sudden and abrupt banging on the front door. It was loud and harsh, and completely jump-scared me. I was put into a fear-induced frozen state for a moment. The banging was so hard it was actually shaking the walls. Even across the entire house, I could still hear that it was coming from the front door. They were hitting it non-stop. I could even hear them aggressively shaking the door handle. It was such a sudden burst of chaos that I wasn't sure what to make of it. I turned off the shower and quickly got dressed, but as I left my room and walked down the hallway, everything stopped altogether. It was now completely silent. No more sounds at all. I stopped in place, hearing only the wind from outside, and feeling a bit of eeriness set in. I slowly walked downstairs and up to the front door. Nobody was there anymore. I quickly ran to the window and saw that car was still there. The man was no longer inside of it though. Not knowing what was going on, I simply decided to call the police. When they came, they noticed multiple sets of shoe prints in the snow, but they were covered up by the storm soon after. They took the license plate of the car though, and found a picture of the owner. From what I could tell, it was the same guy I'd helped on my porch. In the following days, they waited for him to return, but as far as I know, he never did. It's really disturbing to think about what could have happened that night right outside my door. Was it that same man desperately trying to get in for some reason? Or was it someone with malicious intent? It seems that most people I've told this story, including the police, think the man was running from someone and trying to get help. But what happened afterwards is very much up for debate. Nothing is really known about where that man is now, or what he was running from. There are just a few questions on a long list that will probably never be answered. I'm a 23-year-old woman, but this event took place when I was 15. Growing up, my mom was an addict, and my dad was absent. My mom's boyfriend was abusive too. Fighting, screaming, and chaos was all typical of Dave, my mom's boyfriend at the time. He was deep into drugs as well as my mom, and there'd be random strangers constantly coming in and out of the house at all hours of the day, due to the absence of any proper guardianship. I'm sure you can guess that I ended up in with the wrong crowd by age 13. I was sneaking out to meet boys, drinking, smoking, and doing other things a typical 13-year-old kid should never do. When I was 15, I met this guy named Tyler. I'm using his real name because fuck him. We met one night when me and a few friends were trying to find someone to buy us alcohol. Being stupid teenagers, we would usually just ask strangers who were going into the store. Tyler was the first person we'd asked that night. He said yes and got our drinks for us, then met us in the parking lot where we were waiting for him. He asked us where we were headed and what we were getting into tonight. One of my friends, who we'll call Sarah, told him we were just hanging out and walking around. We lived in a big city with lots of busy streets, so we'd usually just kinda walk around until we found something that caught our interest. On this night, it was already past 10 p.m. Everywhere was closing and the roads were emptying quickly as well. Tyler then invited us to join him in his car and drive around. Us being stupid kids went with him. Sarah and our other friend, who we'll call Kate, sat in the back together. I was up in the front passenger seat. At the time, I was really excited to sit by him. I thought he was a hot older guy with a car. I was way too naive to realize this guy was actually a creep. At first, I thought the drive was quite fun. He took us along a back road that went alongside a river, with trees and railroad tracks on the other side. He drove fast and had his music turned up so loud it was shaking the entire car. He started smoking a blunt and we all joined in on it. Honestly, it was a good time. I didn't see the danger I was putting myself in, or the reckless behavior of this mysterious man that we'd just left with. I'd been sipping on my drink during the drive. At one point, he told me to chug it, which I stupidly did. I was only a 92-pound child, so inevitably I got blasted. That night is pretty faded in some parts. I remember him placing his hand on my thigh throughout the drive. I didn't mind in that state of mind because I really thought I liked him. By the end of the night, Sarah and Kate had to head off home, and Tyler said he'd drop us all off at the store we'd met at before. I got out of the car and he asked me for my phone number. I gave it to him and he kissed me before I got out. I started walking home with my friends. The rest of the night completely blurs out. The next morning, when I checked my phone, I had a text from him. It said something along the lines of, "I want to see you again. Had a real good time." Again, being a naive 15-year-old, I was very happy about this. The following weekend, we all met up again, and he bought us some more drinks. We went for a ride, and he drove fast and played loud music. We smoked and drank again, except this time he grabbed my hand the entire time. This became our routine quickly. He'd pick us up nearly every weekend for months on end. Tyler and I eventually began dating, even though I knew nothing about him. He'd never talk about himself, because all we'd do was drive and listen to loud music. Again, I didn't see an issue with it. I thought this man was awesome. Until this happened. One of the weekends we were all supposed to meet, I got a text from him, asking if it could just be me and him this time. Luckily, my instincts actually kicked in, and I told him I wasn't feeling well. I didn't want to ditch my friends. They were already on their way to meet me. The night went on as normal, us girls hanging out on my porch and gossiping, when suddenly his car drove really slowly past my house. He didn't stop, but instead kept going down the road. Immediately, I got a kind of weird feeling. Within 2 minutes, I'd received a message from him. "Why did you lie to me?" I replied, "I'm not lying, they just came to bring me some snacks. They were checking in on me, you know?" I was definitely continuing to lie. I remember him getting really upset. He should be the one to bring me things. He should be the one to check up on me. I was feeling a little guilty until Kate asked me, "Hey, has he been here before? How did he know where you live?" That's when my brain finally started to think, hey, something's not right about that. Obviously, we always met him at the store. He'd never picked me up or dropped me off at my house, and we'd never talked about where we lived. I texted him again. I asked him how he knew where I was. He played it off like he'd accidentally stumbled down my street, and just so happened to be driving very slowly by my house specifically. Whatever. I didn't reply. I had been distracted by my friends. Eventually they left and I went back inside, getting ready for bed. I showered, brushed my teeth, turned on the TV. The sounds of whatever my mom and her people were doing downstairs in the basement were ringing throughout the house. I remember waking up at 4:12 a.m. I checked my phone to see what time it was. I'd been woken up by a notification text from Taylor. "Hey, can you meet me?" It was sent just shortly ago. I texted back telling him I was sleeping, but he insisted on seeing me. I had to firmly reply no before turning my phone on Do Not Disturb. I went back to sleep. When I woke up that morning and turned my phone off Do Not Disturb, texts started to flood in, as well as missed calls. All from Tyler, as I'm sure you guessed. Hundreds of them. I read each one as they flooded through my screen, noticing his attitude and tone changed throughout the night. He started off saying he missed me and wanted to see me. Later on, he was calling disgusting names and threatening me. I had 20 missed calls from him as well. My heart sank to my stomach when I noticed a photo of him. It was a selfie of him holding a weapon to his head. He was smiling with his eyes wide open. It scared me so bad that I texted him back, which I'm sure was his goal. I told him I was sorry for falling asleep, and I didn't mean to ignore him. "Can we meet now?" was his only response. I was beginning to feel a little creeped out and threatened by him, obviously, so I declined. I told him I didn't think this was going to work out. I blocked his number. I really thought that would be the end of whatever this was. I simply moved on from it. I'd basically forgotten all about him, and it was just a memory to me now. Weeks had passed by when I got a message request from an account on Facebook I didn't recognize. I accepted it to see what they'd say. It was a picture of the outside of my house. My heart felt like it had stopped, and I felt the color rush from my face. I knew immediately this must be Tyler. I messaged them back and told them to leave me alone, or I'd tell my stepdad. I didn't hear anything for the rest of the day until late that night. It was around 11, and I was home alone for the night. My mom and her man had gone to the cinema. I got a message, another photo. I remember feeling nervous and scared. I opened the message. It was a picture of me sitting on the edge of my bed looking at my phone. It was in my previous day's outfit. He had taken a photo of me the night before. That creep had been watching me from outside my window just last night. I didn't even realize he was there. I immediately began to panic, not knowing how to handle this situation on my own. My phone got another message. "Come outside," he said. I was frozen. I didn't know if he was trying to scare me or what his intentions were, but I knew this was not good. I didn't reply. I was too scared to even move. I was completely frozen. Another message came in. "Hey, I'm at your front door." I checked my Ring camera, and sure enough, there he was standing right on my front porch, phone in hand. He was typing something out as I watched. I was so scared that I called the police, and they told me to stay in my room and lock my door. The whole time, he continued telling me to come out and meet him. I even heard him try to get in a few times. After about 5 minutes of complete and utter terror, I heard the police sirens nearing my house. I felt a rush of relief come over me, because I knew this was almost over. To my surprise, he actually stayed, and they took him away in handcuffs. He's still doing time for all the crimes they caught him in. They found weapons, sex toys, drugs, and a gun in his car, along with all the messages he'd sent me. They charged him extra for me being a minor. When I finally found out his age, it made me sick to even think of it. He was almost 30 years old at that time. I was 15. My mom eventually went to rehab and is doing much better. We moved away from that city, and I'm now engaged to a wonderful and loving man. We have a child on the way. My life has gotten a lot better, and I'm happy now, but I can't help but feel an overwhelming amount of fear whenever I think of Tyler. Will he try to find me again when he's released? Will he still be obsessed with me? Or will he do this again to another naive child? Girls and boys out there, please hang out with people your own age. Don't do what I did. Be sure to listen to your parents when they tell you not to talk to strangers, and stay safe out there. I own a janitorial business that specializes in cleaning office buildings for mid to large-size companies. Due to the nature of the job, we start our shifts at 6 p.m. on weekdays because most offices don't want us inside during business hours while all their employees are still working. On this day, I got to the scheduled office building at 6:30, putting in the keypad passcode and getting all my equipment in, then locking the doors behind me. The building was only 2 stories, which was much smaller than most, but both floors were really big. There was also a smaller basement level. I started on the second story and wanted to work my way down. I went around grabbing all the trash, grabbing anything off the floor that would get in my way, and then tied up the bags and brought them out to the dumpsters at the back of the building. While I was out there, though, I noticed 2 parked cars. Neither of them were on, but what was really odd about this was that this was the only building nearby, and supposedly nobody was supposed to be here right now. I just didn't know why they would be parked out back of the building, or where the person could even be if not in their cars. I went back inside and double-checked that all the doors were locked up. I continued on with my work, but occasionally checked out the windows to see if there were any changes with the vehicles out there. Everything seemed to be the same. I finished up with the top floor and moved my way down to the first floor, doing the same process. This time when I went out to toss the trash in the dumpster though, I noticed a single light was on in one of those vehicles. Almost as soon as I stepped outside, it turned off. Something about this made me uneasy. I quickly tossed everything and went back inside. Seeing that someone was actually in there made it even more odd. I tried to work faster, finishing the floor by 11 p.m. That was much quicker than the previous one. Now it was just the small basement level, and I'd be all done. I moved everything down and got to work. This level was mostly full of boxes. It was more of a storage warehouse area. While I was down there, I heard a thud echo through the building. It had come from one of the floors above me. I couldn't tell much of what the sound was or on what floor it was either. All I knew was that it came from above. I put down my things and started walking up the steps. I stopped halfway through when I heard voices coming down the upper hallway. 2 men were talking back and forth at a regular volume, like they weren't even afraid of me being in there. I slowly crept back down the stairs and moved behind one of the boxes. I went to dial 911. Before I had the chance to say anything though, the footsteps began making their way down to the basement. I only saw the man's shadow on the wall. Before I completely hid myself behind the shelf of boxes, I heard him walk around and then yell upstairs to the other man. "Hey, I don't see him. I think we're good." He walked up the steps and I peered out one more time, seeing this shadow. I could tell he was holding something small in his hand. I reconnected with 911 and explained what I could. I waited there for several minutes. During this time, the men were mostly on the top floor, then moved back down to the first. Suddenly, one of them yelled, "Hey, the van is still here!" Both of their footsteps started rushing around, but not leaving. They were clearly looking for me. It was hard to control and quiet down my breathing, hearing them running and searching through the building, moving things around right above me. Their footsteps rushed down to the basement stairs as one of them began throwing boxes around, looking everywhere. The sounds of sirens approaching caught the other man's attention, who alerted the one in the basement. Both of them ran away. I stayed hidden until an officer came down to get me. It took 2 hours for the suspects to get apprehended. They declined to share why they'd broken in, but a few stolen items were found in their cars. It's safe to say they weren't the smartest, as they seemed to just guess whether I'd left rather than start by looking for my van to see if I was still there. Regardless, them not leaving after finding out I was inside was probably the scariest thing I'll ever experience. Thankfully, I didn't have to find out what would have happened if they'd found me. I live in Irvine, California, which, if you don't know, is the safest large city over 200,000 people in the United States. My whole life, I was never worried about a break-in or anything like that, until one horrifying day. I was lying in bed on a Saturday morning, sleeping in. Suddenly, my dad sprinted into the room and handed me a wooden baseball bat. He was completely out of breath. "Don't leave this room, and don't let anyone touch you." At this point, I was scared shitless. My 12-year-old mind could only imagine what was coming at me. I backed into my closet and clutched that bat for dear life. All of a sudden, the doorbell rang. I just about jumped out of my skin. I was shaking beyond imagination. For all I knew, our house was being raided. Little did I know that wasn't far from the truth. My dad had been outside early in the morning, working in the yard like he usually did. All of a sudden, a young man came around the corner sprinting. He dropped some sort of bag into the bushes and didn't notice for a moment. My dad went over and grabbed it from the bush. The boy turned back around and saw my dad holding it. The boy got in a panic and kept running. Well, apparently it was a bag full of drugs. My dad calmly walked inside and put that bag down. He decided to wait a bit and call the police. He returned outside and started to work again. All of a sudden, around the corner came 2 large SUVs. Out jumped 6 men, all with guns in hand. That's the point my dad sprinted inside to call the police and hand me the bat. Then the doorbell rang. Of course we didn't answer it. We waited for the police to arrive. The police never found any of the guys, but that was definitely the scariest moment of my life. We live in a rural neighborhood with several other houses within sight. Lots of woods and fields around though. Nearly everyone, except for me, owns dogs that they let run loose around the neighborhood. The day before this occurred, a stray collie had showed up in the area, taking up residence on my front porch, alternately playing and fighting with the local dogs. It was 2 days before Christmas. My husband had made a last-minute decision to spend Christmas with his ailing grandparents, 1,200 miles away. It was impossible for me to accompany him, so I was going to be spending the next week alone. We were rarely apart overnight, so I was having a difficult time falling asleep without him. I was almost about to drift off on the wee morning hours of Christmas Eve when I heard footsteps on the front porch. For context, my bedroom is right adjacent to that area, and my headboard is about 5 feet away from the front door on the other side of the wall. In my sleepy state, when I heard those footsteps, my first thought was that my little brother must be stopping by for a late-night chat. The stray collie, still on the porch, started barking and growling. My sleep-fogged brain finally remembered that my brother always came to the back door, not the front. I sat up and listened in closer. The dog was barking fiercely now, growling and snarling in a way that made chill bumps stand up on my arm. There was a scuffle, and the dogs around the neighborhood started echoing the dog's bark, more growling and snarling, then a sudden silence. I laid there for a moment. For some reason, I was so tired that I decided it must have been a bunch of dogs fighting on the porch, and they had fought with that young collie. I eventually fell asleep from exhaustion. The next morning when I woke up and went into the living room, the window next to the front door was open about 2 feet, and the screen had been removed. The stray collie was nowhere to be found either. I had bought my first house in my early 20s and lived all alone. I was content and at peace living alone, and decided to buy a house out in the country as opposed to an urban setting like my apartment had been located in. I had a few neighbors, but most of them kept to themselves, and I did too. The house was a ranch-style home, which meant there was no second floor, only a basement and first floor. The master bedroom was on the back side of the house, looking straight into the small backyard. Then there was nothing but woods beyond that. Since the basement was underground, the outside entry door had what was referred to as a bilko door, which is composed of 2 steel doors that swing out to each side, then a set of steps taking you down to a standard-sized entry door into the basement of the home. I normally don't keep those bilko exterior doors locked, especially in the summertime, just in case I need to get into the basement from the backyard. During the winter, though, I don't really need to get in or out of the basement, so I lock those doors up. Sometimes even in the fall as well. The first 2 years there were quiet, peaceful, and enjoyable. I could walk out my back door and go hunting in the woods just behind my house. I would get up in the mornings on days off and just open my garage door from sunrise to sunset with no issues at all. No one was coming around uninvited or anything. I worked a rotating 12-hour day/night shift schedule, which was brutal to get used to. I often had a lot of trouble switching from night shift to day shift, either sleeping too much or not enough. The work schedule repeated itself in a pattern, though, so it was nice to at least plan days off in advance. One particular night in December, I had just finished my 3 work days of night shift. It was hard trying to fall asleep at night on that first night off, but it was essential to get my body back to sleeping at night again, to change back to the day shift work schedule, which I needed for the following 3 days. This first transition night, I would typically sleep very lightly. It had been snowing outside since dark, which was around 5 p.m. or so. There were a few inches already on the ground by the time I'd went to bed. That was around 11 p.m. I fell asleep within the hour. I woke up at around 3 o'clock. The house was dead silent. I laid there in the complete darkness, hoping I would just drift right back to sleep soon. But after 2 to 3 minutes, I heard a violent banging right outside my bedroom window. I recognized that sound. Someone was trying to open the locked basement bilko doors. I jumped out of bed and ran down the long hallway to the opposite end of the house, where the rear sliding glass door was. The outside floodlights switched on. I switched on the actual lights as well and looked out the sliding glass door toward the basement doors. There wasn't anybody there. I looked a bit closer. I could see fresh footprint tracks in the snow coming from the small path in the woods leading right up to the basement doors. There was no snow on the handle either, indicating someone had just tried to open them. I saw a second set of footprints leading away from the basement doors with a rooster tail, indicating someone had run as fast as they could away from my house. I stayed awake until almost dawn, leaving the lights turned on to the back side of the home. I decided to follow those tracks into the woods at daybreak, but the newly fallen snow and blowing wind had covered them up completely. After I made it a few feet into the woods, I concluded that whoever was trying to break in had probably heard me waking up and moving down the hallway inside the house. They'd run off into the woods before I was able to get to the sliding glass door and turn on the lights. I decided not to call the police, since nothing was damaged or stolen. From that day on, though, I made sure to keep all the doors locked and no longer left the garage door open all day. After all, nobody else was supposed to be around this area at that time. Yet there they were nonetheless. I later sold the house without any further incidents occurring since that one particular event. When I was 16, I lived with my parents in a normal home in the suburbs. My parents were the type to take a lot of trips, both for work and for leisure. They would do so all throughout the year, so when they would go during the school year, I'd stay home and watch the house, anywhere from a couple of days to an entire week. I didn't really mind, and sometimes I even enjoyed it. During this week, my parents were both away for 6 days, so pretty much every night I'd go out and get food from somewhere. It was on the second night alone that I played video games on the computer for nearly 4 hours straight. It was a Friday, so I was staying up late. I didn't have any homework to do, but around 8:15 I realized I hadn't eaten anything yet. I took a break and got in my car, driving to a sandwich shop nearby. It was close to closing time, so I wasn't expecting a line or anything. When I walked in there was a single man standing at the counter. He looked like he'd just ordered and was waiting for his food to be delivered. I stepped around him, and an employee took my order. Then I stood behind the man and waited as well. While I was standing there, I noticed how rugged the man looked. He was tall and skinny, wearing beat-up clothes and having long, thinning hair. He got his order and left, but I couldn't help but watch him leave, intrigued by his unusual appearance. A couple minutes later, I got my own food. I went out to my car and hopped in, leaving the parking lot. It wasn't very busy out, so I got home very quickly. I went to my room and sat down at my desk. I turned on a video to watch while I ate. It was 9 p.m. by then, but I wasn't that tired yet. I was planning on staying up another few hours at least. As I sat there, though, I heard a quick and subtle sound from downstairs. I paused the video and listened in, but I didn't hear anything more. I stood up and leaned my head out into the hallway, listening again. I was still not hearing anything. By this point, I had no idea what that sound was. I wasn't paying attention enough, and it was so quick that I couldn't even really tell where in the house it had come from. Although I was thinking it was probably nothing, I still wanted to check to be sure. I walked downstairs and looked around. There wasn't much to be seen. Everything seemed just how it had been left. As I walked past the front door, though, I realized what the sound was. I grabbed the door handle and shook it, recreating the exact sound I'd just heard. Someone was trying to get in. I quickly looked out the peephole, not seeing anything. I ran around the back door and scanned the backyard until my eyes fell upon a figure. They were facing away from the house, standing at the door to the shed. They were tall and thin. After a few moments, I recognized them. I was positive it was the man I'd seen earlier that night at the sandwich shop. A moment later, he forced the shed doors open and stepped inside. I took this as my chance to call the police. I ran up to my room and dialed 911. I watched the shed from my room window. The operator said officers were en route, but less than a minute later, the man ran out of the shed holding several large tools. He hurried toward the home, heading straight for my back door. I ran out into the hallway to see if I could do anything to stop him, or maybe even flee from the house. I was stopped in my tracks by the piercing thud of metal slamming against the back door. My adrenaline spiked, and in those few moments, I made the decision to run for it. I sprinted down the stairs and straight for the front door. I could see the man continuing to break down the back door. I ran into my front yard and out onto the street, running to the corner of the block. A few minutes passed by before 2 police cars pulled into the driveway and went in through the open front door. I made my way back to the house, getting there just as they pulled the man out and put him into their police car. They'd found him holding a heavy pipe wrench that he'd gotten from my parents' shed. He'd broken into the house while I was outside. It looked like the man had gone on an absolute rampage, destroying everything he could in the few minutes it took for the cops to arrive. Why he followed me home and did what he did is unknown, but the man clearly did not seem very mentally stable. If I had chosen to stay inside, there's no doubt that man would have broken into my room before the cops would have made it. I don't think anyone can know for sure what he would have done to me. It was January, and I was renting out a winter cabin that was by an ice fishing lake. It was a very small, bare-bones cabin, with only the essentials. It was only there for people like me, who liked going out on the lake for fishing, or ice fishing. I'd usually bring a friend along with me, but sometimes I also went all by myself. I'd never had any issues with doing that. I had planned out 3 days there with no other real plans in mind, except sitting out by the lake and doing some fishing. The first day when I got there, I set my things in the cabin and made myself at home, brewing some hot coffee and relaxing by the fireplace for most of the afternoon. This cabin was only a single room, so the bed, fireplace, and everything else was all in one area. Anyway, I fell asleep quite early and woke up at around 7 a.m. I wanted to head out to the lake in the morning. It was about a 10-minute walk from the cabin, down a short forested path that was entirely covered in snow. Once I reached the lake area, I found a good spot and got my things situated. I drilled into the ice and started my fishing. I find it to be really stress-relieving to just sit there and fish all day. I know a lot of other people find it to be boring though. I stayed on the lake for several hours, probably at least 4, then packed up my things. The snow was really starting to pick up, and the wind was getting heavier and heavier. I walked off the lake and back onto the path. Immediately, I noticed something curious, a set of footprints in the snow, going alongside mine from earlier. They went right up to the edge of the lake I was at, then turned around and went back down the path toward the cabin. I was feeling a little uneasy suddenly. Someone was out there and had been right behind me, maybe watching me. I chose to follow those prints and see where they led to. They mostly went along with the path, going right back to the cabin. Instead of going up to it though, they suddenly veered off into the woods. As far as I could see, they continued in a perfectly straight line, going through the trees. I was even more confused and slightly nervous now. I went back inside the cabin and warmed up by the fireplace. There was nothing else out here for miles from what I was aware of, so anyone being out here was just odd, especially when it was snowing so heavily in the winter. I made food and stayed in the cabin for the rest of the night, keeping the fireplace running. I was mostly just doing some reading. About an hour after sunset, I heard movement outside, a very light crunching in the snow, but in the recognizable pattern of someone walking. I moved over to the window and looked. Instantly, I saw a figure out by the trees, walking toward the path. They were wearing this thick black clothing, covering every part of them. It made it hard to get any details about what they looked like. Once they got onto the path, they turned and started coming right for the cabin. I ducked my head down now, just listening to the footsteps getting closer and closer until they were right up to the wall. The footsteps moved to the side, coming right up to the window I was hiding under. Their shadow moved around, like they were peering inside the cabin. Then they stopped all of a sudden. I tilted my head to look up and see what was going on, only to find their eyes staring right back at me. I jumped away, now standing a few feet away from the window. The person tried to lift it open. I ran and grabbed a nearby knife. Still, they tried to open the window. After a few failed attempts though, the person ran off. I watched their figure disappear into the snowy woods, going in the same direction I'd seen them come from earlier. After that, I packed up and ran to my car, leaving the area only a few minutes later. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but they knew I was staying there after seeing me at the lake and willingly came back in the middle of the night to try and break in through the window. They definitely had something horrible in mind for me. Luckily, I got out unharmed, but I have a feeling that night was close to being my last. This happened in January of 2020 when I was 18. Over winter break, I had signed up for DoorDash since a couple of my friends were also doing it. I didn't really need the money as I was in high school and still living with my parents, but it was more to just have something to do. As a kid, a couple $100 a week was pretty damn nice. The first few nights went smoothly. I got the hang of it after the first 3 or 4 orders, and after that it was all just the same sort of work cycle. During my second week, I started working more, getting excited about making money for the first time. I tried to make as much as I could. My friends were doing the same. They had mentioned that on days with bad weather, you'd usually make even more. On the one night when the snow started coming down, I chose to hit the road and do some deliveries. For the first hour, I was FaceTiming one of my friends as we were both driving around. He stopped and went home around 8 though. It was a Saturday, so I could stay out as late as I wanted. By 10 o'clock, I was getting a little bored. I took up one more order, I got the bag, and drove to the neighborhood. This was just some regular street with very average houses. By now, the snow had covered up everything though, which made it both hard to drive and hard to see the numbers on the buildings. I slowly made my way down the street until finally finding the right address. It was a 2-story, very typical-looking suburban home. It even still had Christmas lights hanging on the trees outside. I parked and put my hazards on, then got out. I double-checked the bag had everything and walked up the driveway. As I approached the front porch, though, I saw the front door was open. Not all the way, but just enough for it to be considered strange, considering it was snowing and so cold. I figured it was so I could leave the bag inside the house, rather than out in the snow. When I got up to the door, I pushed it a little bit more open and slid the bag inside. Just as I pulled my phone out to take a picture for confirmation, I heard a woman's voice yell from across the house. She asked if I was the delivery person, dropping off her order. It sounded like a young woman, maybe even in her early 20s. Yeah, I put it right here in your doorway. I was not expecting any conversation. The woman responded right away. She asked if I could push the door open and bring the bag inside to her. I knew it was strange to be asking me to go in their house, but I pushed the door open just to see where they were. Past the entrance, there was this long hallway that led to what I assumed to be the kitchen. On the wall, I could see the clear shadow of the woman, who was presumably standing around the end of the corner. Where do you want me to bring it? There was a long moment before the woman responded. She leaned half of her body around the corner and showed herself at the end of the hallway. She urged me to bring it on over to her and gestured with her hands for me to come inside. Then she slipped back around the corner and out of sight. I realized that the shadow outline on the wall had not moved with her. It was someone else's shadow, standing somewhere by her around the corner. I stood there for a second as I felt blood rush through my body. I quietly placed the bag down and took a few steps back before turning and rushing away from the house. I stumbled into my car and glanced back at the home. As I pulled away, in the front window, the figure of a large man approached and watched my car as I left. I stopped at a nearby gas station to catch my breath and rethink everything that just happened. It was pretty clear by how everything played out that this was some kind of a trap. I also knew the police would have nothing but my word to go off of. I did end up reporting it, but when they went to the house to ask the woman about what happened, she denied that anyone else was there. They denied the officers access to search the home for anyone else too. Like I said, the police were unable to do anything at the time. What the woman and the man were trying to do by getting me inside their house is unknown. I can only imagine they would have robbed me at the least, and at the worst, I wouldn't be here right now. I've been a police officer for my county for almost a decade now. I've seen some crazy and disturbing things, sometimes making me question why I even chose this career path. What happened on this night, though, still sticks with me and is often the event that I think about the most. It was nearing the end of winter, but where I'm located, it always stays cold until about mid-spring. This night, I was set to be on patrol of the major highway for most of my shift. On a typical night, I would stop maybe 2 or 3 cars for speeding. Otherwise, not much would happen. Sometimes a call for backup would come in, but usually patrol shifts were boring and uneventful. I was driving along the highway, doing the usual circle until around 2 a.m. or so. That was when I passed a car on the side of the road that hadn't been there before. Its lights were off and it was sat on the shoulder of the highway. I didn't see it until I was already passing by. I turned off the next exit and made the entire circle, taking about 15 minutes before I got back to where I'd seen it. I was under the assumption it was an abandoned, broken-down vehicle. Maybe I just hadn't noticed it before. I wasn't in a rush. I pulled in behind it, parking about 15 feet away, and leaving my headlights on. I called in to report that I was investigating a presumably empty vehicle on the side of the southbound highway. I got out with my flashlight and walked up to the car. My first impression was of how old it looked. It looked like something from the 80s and was rusted all over, dents and scratches throughout. I walked up to the driver's side window and held my flashlight up. Nobody seemed to be inside. As I glanced around, I happened to notice some worrying signs, though. There was a pile of clothes in the back seat that looked like they belonged to a young woman. The way they were scattered around, though, didn't look right. I moved over to the other side of the vehicle, but a faint sound from behind me caught my attention. I quickly turned and pointed my flashlight into the woods surrounding the highway. Immediately, the sound stopped, but I'd heard enough to know it was footsteps. Someone was walking out there watching me. I yelled out, directing them to move into the light with their hands raised. A moment passed by and I called out again. There was no response. Everything was silent. I felt my heart beating in my chest as I called in to update on the situation and get some backup to come. I stood there staring into the woods. If something had happened in this car, there would be reason for whoever was out there to try and stop me from finding out. I drew my firearm and moved further behind the car, keeping an eye on that tree line. The next 5 minutes were brutally nerve-wracking. Finally, another officer pulled onto the scene. Right away, I heard footsteps sprinting into the woods. We immediately got to searching the rest of the vehicle. It was clear that something bad had gone down here. But searching the woods in the middle of the night with someone likely dangerous out there was not a safe option. Along with indicators of violence, we found an empty ammo package. It was likely they had a firearm on them. Knowing someone was out there watching me the whole time, maybe even having me in the sights of their weapon, was one of the most unnerving things to even think about. The following day, we were able to get some more information and run a more thorough investigation. The car was untraceable. Although some shoe prints were found in the woods, they faded out pretty quickly, without any direction. What really happened in that car that night still remains an open case. The clothes were suspected to belong to a woman who was reported missing. But with no leads on who that suspect was, it's just left me unable to stop thinking about it. I'm a 24-year-old male, and a few years ago I picked up a job at a local grocery store. I was doing community college and just wanted some money to help pay for food and going out with friends. After a couple of months of working there, I started to get used to the regular customers that came in. Most of them were nice and otherwise average people, but this one guy always had something weird about him. He came in most nights around 9 p.m., which was an hour before closing. He would walk around the store for a long time before eventually returning with 1 or 2 items and checking out. For how long he would spend walking around every night, it was really weird that he'd always only end up with a couple of things. He didn't ever talk much, but I assumed he was living on the streets or out of his car. That would explain why he only ever got a few things, and his clothes were never clean. He just kinda looked unkempt all around. Anyway, this went on for several weeks, if not months on end. I never thought too much of it after a while, because it was such a normal part of work now. One night he came in as usual, but instead of walking around the store, he came right up to the register. I asked if he needed help with anything. The man just kinda looked at me for a second before asking if I drove an old Toyota that was out in the parking lot. I immediately found it a bit weird that he would know that, but I said yes because I didn't see where this was going. I thought maybe there was something wrong with my car. Instead, the man kept a straight face and walked away immediately. Obviously, this was really weird. I asked my coworker to watch over the registers for a moment. I went out to the front of the store and looked out into the parking lot. My car was right where I'd parked it and didn't seem to have anything wrong with it. I went back inside to the register, thinking I would ask the man when he came to check out, but he never did that night. I don't know when he left, but the store closed without him ever coming like he usually would. When I left, I checked all around my car and nothing seemed off about it. It left me totally confused as to what that was all about. The next day, I planned to ask the man again, but he didn't come in for the whole next month. The man never showed up again. I was just left to wonder why he'd asked about my car seemingly out of nowhere and for no reason. On a Saturday night, I clocked out of work as usual. This was the one night of the week where I'd be the only cashier, so at the end of the night I was always left by myself. When I began walking through the parking lot toward my car, I got this real strange feeling in my gut. I just remember something feeling wrong. Maybe there really was some intuition about something. It was really unnerving me. I walked quickly and got in my car, glancing around the lot. It was pretty much empty and had nothing to give me reason to believe that something was wrong at all. I turned my car on, and just before I put it in drive, I heard the slightest sound from right behind me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the mirror that was facing my back seat. I left the car running as I sprinted out and stood a few spaces away, looking at my window to the back seat. I could see a figure moving around. I turned and ran for the store, going back in and calling the police. By the time they arrived, my car was empty. There was no signs of forced entry either, so they had to have some illegal key copy or something. Or I'd have to have left the doors unlocked by accident. I'm fairly certain it was the strange man from weeks ago. But I didn't know why if it was him though. Maybe he had been trying to get in there for the entire month I hadn't seen him, and was waiting for me to forget to lock the doors. I think that I locked them that night, but every once in a while I do forget without even knowing, so I can't write that off completely. The man that was back there clearly wasn't just trying to rob the vehicle. He even tried to stay hidden after I'd gotten in and turned it on. It's horrifying knowing that I was so close to having left that parking lot and drove away unknowingly with the person in the back seat. Once we'd left, who knows what would have happened. They might have waited until I pulled into my house, or I may have never even gotten home that night. I often wonder if kids play games like hide-and-go-seek anymore. I know a lot of kids have smartphones, video game systems, computers, things like that. It makes me wonder how many of them go out and play old games still. In a similar vein, when I was a kid, the neighborhood used to be crawling with kids going trick-or-treating on or around Halloween. I still live in the same area and haven't had one single kid knock on my door for candy in at least 10 years. If they don't though, at least I know they won't ever have to experience something like I did once back then. I don't remember how old I was exactly, but this was sometime in the late 70s, I believe. I might have been around 8 or 9 at the time. I was out playing some hide-and-go-seek with my friends, and a fairly large group of them too. I was a very competitive person. I always felt like I had to win the game no matter what. Because of this, I spent some extra time always looking for the best places to hide. I would always go the farthest from the base, but I wasn't worried about making it back safely. I just wanted to be impossible to be found, to the point where the person who was it would eventually give up, and I would get to come out scot-free. We'd had a few rounds of the game, and I hadn't achieved this quite yet. I was lucky enough to not be it at any point yet at least. I was determined to find a really good place to hide, but I didn't know any spots that were good enough in the area I was in. I trotted off down the street, thinking that the further away I was, eventually I would find some place that would be a great place to hide. I was walking behind a house when suddenly the back door shot open. A man was standing in the doorway. I had never seen him before. He motioned at me to start coming towards him, and I did. I normally always did whatever the adults asked me to do. "Say, you kids are playing hide and seek, right?" he asked me. He was basically whispering at the time. I thought it was because he didn't want to reveal to the person who was it where I was and spoil our game. "Yeah?" I responded. "I got a real good spot where they'll never find you," the man whispered to me. "Come in here. I'll let you hide out in my basement." Well, to an 8-year-old kid, that sounded like a great idea. We weren't supposed to go into houses while playing, but if no one could find me, no one would ever know I'd broken the rules. Also, if an adult was okay with breaking the rules, then why shouldn't a kid be? I ran up to the guy's house and was getting close to the entrance when I heard a voice yell at me. "Andy, you get over here right now!" It was my older brother. He was around 13 at the time. He wasn't playing the game with us, but I guess it was around dinner time and he had been sent out to search for me. I turned back to the man who was offering to let me hide in his basement, but he slammed the door shut and ran back into his house. My brother came and grabbed me by the arm. He pulled me back toward the area we lived in. "Don't ever talk to that man again," he told me sternly. "He's not a good person." I didn't understand it at the time, but I knew my brother very well, and there was an edge to his voice that made me absolutely obey him. I found out later there were stories about this guy and the things he would do to children. I don't know if they were true, because I always thought he would be in jail if they were. However, I can't really think of any other reason he would try to get an 8-year-old to hide in his house's basement. This happened when I was at high school. I was pretty young and got into a car accident as I was on the way to school, and the car was pulling out of a car park just as I was about to cross the road. I waited, the driver also paused, and we were both still. The driver then did the usual gesture of go ahead with his hand and allowed me to go ahead and cross the road. Well, I started to walk across the road and raised my hand to thank the driver. At that point, the car pulled forward and knocked me right off my bike. I remember sitting up in the road in a complete daze. I stared down at my legs as they were bleeding. For some reason, I just shouted, "It's an accident!" The driver came rushing out of his car. As he crouched down by my side, he said in a very monotonous voice, "Are you alright? Can you still make it to school?" I was confused. I wanted to get away from this guy. Something felt weird about him. I said, "Yeah, I could still make it." As soon as I replied to him, he swiftly walked back to his car and pulled away. I ended up going to school that day, and when I told my friends about what happened, they were so surprised. "Hey man, go and see the school nurse, you're bleeding and bruised." My friends were very concerned. Well, I took this friend's advice and went to go see the nurse. I didn't know the name of the guy who'd hit me. I didn't know how often he used that parking spot, and I hadn't really gotten a good look at him either. I doubted I would be able to find him. It was frustrating when I couldn't answer any of the nurse's questions. My wounds healed up and about a half a year passed by. I was initially very suspicious every time I crossed a road, but I slowly grew less wary. That was until I was crossing the road at the very same parking lot on my bike again, and the exact same thing happened. Moreover, it was the same driver. This time he hit me so hard I was launched into the road, and my bike flew even further. Again, the driver got out of the car and slowly walked over to me. "Can you still make it to school?" He didn't even wait for my response this time. He just got back in his car, drove around my bike, and fled from the scene. I felt so helpless. I was only 14 years old, and here was this fully grown adult running me over for no reason. It was horrible. I couldn't do anything. This last time, I went to see the school nurse. I changed the route I walked to school. I didn't want to go past that car park again. There was another incident in the same parking lot it happened in too. A kid a few grades below mine. He was hit by a car pulling out of the parking lot. According to the kid's friends at school, the driver got out of the car and asked the kid if he could still make it to school. At this point, I knew this was more than just a coincidence. This was malicious and intentional. I was sure of it. Another incident happened soon after. This time, a kid was hit by a car. The kid didn't get up, but a passerby who witnessed the crash rushed him to the hospital, thankfully. He was able to survive. The passerby took down the driver's number plate. The driver was arrested. It was really great to know this guy wouldn't be driving around there anymore. They had an assembly about it at school, asking for any of the other victims to come forward. So I did. I was interviewed by the police. They confirmed what I already knew. I had been hit by the same guy both times, and so had the other kids. We weren't the only victims either. The man offered no explanation as to why he did this. Maybe he had a private grudge against students or our school. Maybe he just wanted to test how hard a student could get hit by his car and still recover. I guess I'll never know. I'm still very conscious of these events though. That man was a complete psycho, running over people on purpose and leaving them in the street, especially doing this to children. I used to get freaked out by ghosts, but now I'm terrified of humans instead. I spent a little bit of time basically homeless, living out of my car. I was a lot luckier than other homeless people, I suppose. I had a job and I could find places to shower and do all of that while I was trying to save up for a place to live. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't the greatest life either, as you can probably imagine. The hardest thing though was finding a place to park and sleep throughout the night. This was in the late 1990s, in the far north suburbs of Chicago. I tried sometimes parking in apartment building parking lots, but they were just as difficult to stay in as business parking lots. You had to have permits for basically anywhere that you parked, proving you were a resident of that building. Since I wasn't a resident of any of these buildings, that was really hard to do. Because of this, I had to switch around quite a lot. I would rarely stay in the same place 2 times. I would drive around and find places at the last minute. Motel parking lots were decent for a night, but I would have to get up early in the morning to keep from getting caught there. This was happening during the winter time too. I was working and there was a snowstorm that had been on the verge of breaking all day long. It had been slowly snowing and building up all day. This didn't really bother me. I thought at the very least that with snow piling up over the cars, no one would be paying much attention to where I was parking mine. I thought it would be a pretty easy night for me. I couldn't have been more wrong. I didn't realize just how much more difficult finding a parking space in a snowstorm would be than normal. I couldn't find anything anywhere for the longest time until I finally gave up because I was tired. I'd never tried sleeping parked on the side of the street by a meter or anything for fear of a cop walking by and seeing me. I thought that just this once it would be fine. I laid down with my car covered in built-up snow. Surely no one would notice anyway. I bit it and decided to try this. I found a place to park in town and quietly turned my car off. I crawled into the back seat with tons of my blankets and covered up, determined to get some sleep. I was just about drifting off when I heard a banging on the window of my car. It startled me, of course. Immediately, I thought a police officer must have found me. I looked out from under the blanket, feeling scared because I didn't want to get arrested. What I saw was much scarier than a cop, however. It was what I assumed was another homeless person looking inside my window. I wasn't scared because they were homeless, though. I was scared because of the crazy look on this guy's face and the fact that the man began pounding even harder. He wasn't just knocking on it either. He was pounding on it like he was trying to break it open. "Let me in. Let me in. It's freezing out here." Being homeless myself, I did have some sympathy for the man, but there was no way I was letting this guy into my car. I knew nothing about him. If he was dangerous or had an infectious disease or what have you. I shook my head and told him I couldn't do that. That set off a real bit of ferocity in the man. He began slamming the window even harder, this time definitely trying to break it. "You better let me in or I'll make you pay," he yelled at me. He had this insane look in his eyes that terrified me out of my mind. He was banging so hard I was certain he would break in my window. Scared, all I could think to do was get up and jump into the front seat of the car. I started it up just as the guy successfully busted my back window open. Thankfully, this was not a horror movie, and the car started up right away. I pulled away before anything else happened, but I was definitely shaken up. I went back to the parking lot of the restaurant I worked in. I never tried sleeping there because I didn't want them to know that I lived in my car. With what just happened though, I decided it was worth the risk. Fortunately, although the window was broken, it didn't fall into pieces in the car. It just stayed in place, visibly broken. Still, it let in enough cold throughout the night that it was very difficult for me to get sleep there. When I was in high school, I was in all the clubs. I loved sports, especially basketball. I was hardly ever out of the gym, except for Tuesdays when the volleyball team had the run of the gym. On Tuesdays, I would work out with the team in the local park. We would run into the park, do some stretches, muscle training, then run back to school. One Tuesday, we got to the park, and there was this strange woman there. From that day on, she would always be there. I say she was strange because she would just sit down and stare at us. I think she must have worked in the nearby office because she was always wearing professional clothes. She would often talk to herself too, completely unintelligible things. She seemed completely harmless, and my friends and I were more focused on our training, so we didn't pay her that much attention. When you know someone is staring at you though, especially for a long period of time, it really throws you off. I mean, it was really creepy, and it was every time we went to the park as well. I just tried my best to ignore her. On the day in question, there were about 20 of us training in the park. It was an incredibly hot day, and I could sense that some of the group were very irritable, especially my friend Yuji. For some reason, he took his irritation out on this woman. "Hey, you stare at us every day," he shouted. I was annoyed that he'd done that. I mean, we could have easily just ignored her. I honestly thought people like that were better off left alone anyway. Who knew how she'd react? She didn't say a word back to him. She just scowled and kept staring. Yuji seemed content with his victory and said nothing more to antagonize her. We all headed back to the school soon after. The following Tuesday, we went to run in the park again. But this time, the woman wasn't there. Maybe Yuji shouting at her had really scared her off. I wondered what happened. As we jogged this time, we were able to exercise without being stared at. Honestly, it was very relieving. We stayed a bit longer than we had before. Yuji was at the water fountain, washing his face quickly. I looked away from him for just a second, and when I looked back, she was standing right behind him. I shivered. It felt horrible to see her again. She looked so angry. I could tell something bad was about to happen. She was holding a towel, but she swiftly switched out for Yuji's towel. Yuji hadn't realized she was there. He had his head over the fountain. He blindly gripped for the towel. "Oh God," I heard myself mutter. Some of the other kids around noticed this too. We shouted at him to stop and not touch that towel. He turned his head towards us, and as he did, the woman made a run for it. We ran over to take a look at that towel she'd replaced his with. Interlaced throughout it, there were several long pins like you'd find in a pin cushion. Yuji had an insanely close call there. If he had brought that pin-riddled towel up to his face, who knows how badly he would have been injured. We stopped going to the park for a while and told the school about it. We were worried we would see the woman again. I only saw her once more after I graduated. I saw her out shopping. She was with some friends, acting completely normal. She must have had ice in her veins because she gave me the most friendly smile when she recognized me. I haven't been in contact with Yuji since we graduated. I wonder if he's doing all right after everything that happened. This happened around when I was 10 in the 1980s. My family had a house with a really huge backyard. I had a tent, and occasionally me and my friend Jimmy would camp out in the backyard. We would often set the tent pretty far back from the house so as to have some privacy from our parents. Right behind our yard was this large forest that was fenced off, for some reason that I've never known. It was pretty late at night, and normally we would have already gone to sleep by then. The two of us were up late with the flashlight though, telling ghost stories like kids usually do. We got ourselves pretty worked up, and I guess it could have been our imagination, but we began to hear things outside of the tent. It almost sounded like someone was creeping around in the forest, right on the other side of that fence. We turned our flashlights off. I'm not really sure why, but it seemed like the appropriate thing to do, as if that could make us hear better or something. I know how silly that sounds, but hey, we were 10 years old. Surprisingly, we did clearly make out some sounds out there. Jimmy decided to look out the flap of the tent to see what was going on. I have to admit, I was too frightened to do so myself. Jimmy looked out for a few moments before ducking back into the tent. He told me he could see someone hiding in the bushes just on the other side of the fence. I accused him of trying to scare me, of course. but he swore up and down that he was not. Well, that was around when I heard my mom calling for us. She was still way on the other side of the yard, but it was obvious she was running out towards us. She sounded very distressed. Jimmy and I came out of the tent and hurried over to her. She told us we needed to get into the house ASAP. We were going to grab our things first, but she insisted that could wait until the next day, and we needed to get inside right now. We were told a man who had killed several children had just escaped from prison. The report had come on the news right before my mom had run out and got us. We told her about what we'd heard and what Jimmy claimed to have seen. I have no idea if she believed us or not. She didn't call the police. It was a scary moment when she told us that. I mean, Jimmy swore he saw someone out there, and we both knew what we had heard. We have no way of knowing if whoever was out there was the escaped killer, of course, but at the moment, Jimmy and I both believed it, and the two of us didn't camp out again for a very long time. This happened March of last year. I was living in a really cheap apartment complex. It was all I could afford at the time. The apartment was tiny and my neighbors were a lot older than me. The vibe of the building was very much single dudes. One night in March at around 2 a.m., I was lying on my bed reading a book. I have a habit of staying up late. All of a sudden, I heard a loud banging sound at the door. Someone was trying my door handle as well. It sounded like someone was trying to kick the door in. I could hear it shaking with the impact. I thought it was someone annoyed and making some sort of complaint about noise, but I hadn't made a single sound in the last 2 hours. I didn't have the TV on and I wasn't playing music either. I'm not ashamed to say I was absolutely bricking it at this point. It was really frightening. I managed to muster up enough courage to creep over to the door and put my eye to the peephole. I saw a guy out there I had never seen before. He looked to be about 50 years old and had this totally insane look on his face. I didn't understand why this guy was so pissed off. I hadn't ever had any trouble with any of the residents here. I didn't really want to do so now either, but after 5 agonizing minutes, it was clear this guy was not going to give up hammering on the door. I thought it would be better to talk to this idiot before he woke up the whole damn building. I put the chain on the door and slowly opened it. The instant I inched the door open, a knife jutted through the gap. It danced its way toward me. I pushed on the door as hard as I could, and thankfully the owner of the knife seemed to be weaker than me. The door closed shut the whole way, and everything fell silent. I didn't get a good look at the guy's face. I shouted through the door, "Hey, what the fuck was that?" I never got a reply. I just heard someone board the elevator and it departing. Could it be that someone had mistaken my room for another? Did someone on this floor have a grudge against another person? What kind of grudge provokes a spontaneous knife attack? I thought the residents here were all older anyway. None of this made any sense. Everyone in the building seemed mostly nice, and there had never been any trouble as far as I knew. I just couldn't figure it out. I couldn't do much about it either. I decided I couldn't do anything but get some rest. I had to work the next day anyway. Yes, I know I should have called the police, but I didn't do so. The following night, or if I should more accurately say the following morning, the same thing happened again. The same psycho showed up at my door, knife in hand. I was scared and angry now. The adrenaline was really pumping through me. "What are you doing? You've got the wrong guy. Who does this at this time of night?" I shouted all kinds of stuff, hoping something would make sense to this guy out there. I grabbed a big piece of wood. It was part of a shelf that had recently come down. I was ready to knock some sense into this guy. I was also ready to call the police. I just didn't know which was going to be the most effective first. I decided to take one more look out the peephole. The guy was just kind of standing there in a daze. I got a good chance to look at his face, and that's when I began to recognize him from somewhere. I had only ever bumped into him in the lobby a couple of times. He always made small talk with me and seemed like a really nice older guy. He'd even asked me if I wanted to have dinner with him one of those times. Well, I was really glad I didn't accept that invitation now. I think he lived somewhere below me. I couldn't get my head around this. Why was he now just randomly attacking me? I called the police right away. I kept silent all the while he continued to hammer on my door and try the lock. Anyway, to cut an incredibly frustrating story short, the guy was interviewed by the police when they arrived. I gave my statement, but as far as I can tell, he made it out like he was totally innocent. He pretended he knew nothing about what happened. The cops patronized me and kept asking me if I was under the influence. They warned me not to lie to the cops. Well, I knew what I'd seen. What frightened me the most is that he got away with it so easily. Would he do it again? The police wouldn't do anything about him, I realized. I bumped into him a couple more times before I moved out. He would just smile at me and put his hands in his pockets. I've been struggling to find a reason for his resentment towards me, but I could come up with nothing. Maybe it's because I was young or something. Keep an eye on your neighbors. That old saying, a wolf in sheep's clothing, can really be more true than you realize. I'm a woman. I was leaving my friend's apartment around 10 p.m. to go back to my car that was parked on the street around the corner. I had my 12-pound dog with me, and we were walking towards the car. I'll typically switch the sides of the street I'm walking on to avoid people that looked questionable, or if someone is right behind me. The life of being a woman, since we always have to be alert for that kind of stuff. I was walking up the empty sidewalk to my car when a strange-looking man started crossing the street right towards me. There was no reason for him to be crossing the street that I could tell. I started to get a really bad feeling in my gut and decided to turn around and go back to my friend's apartment. As I turned around, I'd noticed he'd begun sprinting and was now following me. I called my friend and started yelling into the phone. "Come downstairs and let me in. There's a guy behind me." You have to be let into her apartment lobby by a resident on the inside. Me and my dog were sprinting down the street, and I kept looking behind me. The guy was starting to gain on me. I was in a full run, but even so, he was still a bit faster. My dog was so confused, but trying her hardest to keep up. Luckily, my friend was down there, waiting to let me in. We ran in and shut the door. The guy walked by just as I got the door shut. He stopped running and started walking casually as if nothing had ever happened and continued on his way. I waited for 30 minutes, shaking with my heart racing. After I calmed down, my friend walked me to my car this time, and I drove her back to her apartment. I have no idea what might have happened if he'd caught me, but I'd never been so scared for my life. I know this can happen to guys too, but it's sad how every time I'm walking alone, I always have to be on the lookout for guys just like this. Always trust your instincts, even if nothing might happen. It's better to be safe than sorry. I remember one night around 3 a.m. or so, I was sitting at home on my PC watching some movies, playing some games, etc. It was at that point that I noticed I was all out of cigarettes. The only thing that works late at night is our local gas station. It was not too far away from my home, but it was easier to go in a car anyway. I grabbed my car keys, locked up my house, and started driving down to the gas station. I live in a small European country, which is rated as the most safe country on the entire planet. That doesn't mean that no bad things happen here and there, though. When you exit from a suburban area where I live, you need to take a right so you can make the main road. After that, you just go straight for about half a kilometer, then go for another half to get to the gas station. About halfway there, I noticed a girl on the sidewalk, apparently in a run. She looked really panicked. I looked behind her and noticed two guys were 10 feet away chasing her. They were pointing at her and yelling something towards her. And it gave me a really creepy vibe. I pulled in right next to this girl. I noticed she had a scared face on, like she was about to cry and burst into tears. I opened my window and pretended like I knew her, then very quietly asked, "Are you in some trouble?" She looked at me and nodded. I told her to jump in my car, and that's what she did. I told her I was going to the gas station to get some cigarettes, but I would take her home as soon as we got there and I did my business. She thanked me like 100 times. I asked if she wanted me to drive her down to the station to report it, but she said I could just take her home. I went to the gas station, got some cigarettes and some stuff for her, and took her home after. We passed by the same street where those two guys had been chasing her, but they were nowhere to be seen. Imagine what would have happened if I hadn't happened to run out of cigarettes that night. I know this guy who moved to Tokyo when he was about 30. I worked with him. He was a part-time worker. One night, I was around his place. He was hosting a drinking party. We were chatting about his past and why he decided to pack up everything and move out to Tokyo. Well, he kind of avoided the question, but I kept on asking him. He looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Don't ask." I didn't get what the big deal was, so I kept on insisting. We kept on drinking, and I guess eventually the booze loosened his tongue. He told me this creepy little story about his past. After graduating from university, he got himself what he called a normal job in his hometown. He was still living with his parents at the time. One evening, he'd finished up work a little earlier than usual. He was walking home from the station when he saw a woman approaching. She came rushing right up to him. Hey, long time no see," she called out cheerfully. "How are you?" She was making out like they were the closest of friends or something, but he had never seen this woman before as far as he could tell. He wondered if maybe she could be an old friend he'd forgotten or something. It would have felt rude just to outright ask her who she was, so he pretended to go along with it. Yeah, long time. I'm doing well. How are you doing?" The woman stood there smiling at him. Then she plunged her hands into a handbag and pulled out a small navy blue notebook. He caught a glimpse of the front of the book in gold letters. It was a disabled person's notebook, it said. He was surprised because he couldn't see any physical sign of disability in this woman. He asked her about it. What's this?" "Here, take a look." There was a photo of the woman, and right next to her photo it stated she was mentally ill. When he saw the name written in the book, he remembered who she was. When he was in high school and a little more immature, he used to bully this woman a bit. Her name was Michio. Now she was in front of him smiling. He faked a smile back at her. "Don't you remember me? That's a real shame. For the last 10 years, I haven't been able to forget about you. Don't worry, that's okay. You know this notebook here? It protects me. If I killed someone, how much trouble do you think I would get in?" I'm sure that the media and police would wonder, but they wouldn't get that involved once they saw this book. It says that I'm mentally ill. I wouldn't even get prison time or the death penalty. Trust me, I've looked into it. It's not hard to get yourself a little book like this if you know the right people. Did you know that? You know, I really didn't expect to run into you today. I didn't even bring my tools with me. I have big plans for you, you know. I could never take you on though if you knew it was coming, so I guess today's your lucky day. I'm not gonna kill you today, but another day, who knows? She stood there smiling and did a cute wave. She turned her back and left. He said he couldn't move. He was so shocked she had just said all that right to his face. She was smiling, but her eyes were crazed. He knew she meant exactly what she said. If she did have her tools on her that day, she would have killed him instead of ever speaking to him at all. After that encounter, needless to say, he was terrified she would come for him. He was still living with his parents, so it wouldn't have been too hard for her to turn up to his house in the middle of the night. He was scared to sleep. He was scared of what might happen to his folks. He knew he had to leave town right now. He packed up his things and headed for Tokyo. He told his parents not to tell anyone where he was going. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not trying to justify bullying, but that was many years ago when they were kids. And it wasn't even particularly harsh bullying from what I could tell either. Just teasing and stuff like that. This woman coldly calculated her revenge plan. It's not like he still bullied people later into his school years either. He lives in fear each day now. Fear that she'll somehow find him. He only wants to work part-time, so he's not in the public eye as often. But on the other hand, I guess you could call this somewhat of a karma story. It's a very distressing one though, and one that I'll never forget. I do deliveries for my local Papa John's. I'm in college, so this is just one of the few jobs I could choose from. A few of my friends work there too, but we're all delivery drivers, so even when we have the same shifts, we don't really see each other. Anyway, this happened to me last December while I was picking up some extra shifts before Christmas. This night it was snowing a good amount, making deliveries take longer than usual. We were also getting more deliveries than usual. I was never too stressed about work though. Having to go non-stop for hours on end was definitely not enjoyable, but it was still work nonetheless. At 9:30, I grabbed my next set of orders to deliver and jumped in my car to get the directions up. I had 2 orders and the houses happened to be 5 minutes away from each other. They were both pretty far away from the shop though. They were each 15 minutes away, which was more like 30 minutes in this weather. The first part of the drive was completely normal, but then it began taking me toward the less visited part of town. The houses were older and most of the shops in the area had closed. Nobody ever came around here unless they lived here because it was so old. It just wasn't up to today's standards. After 20 minutes of driving, I pulled into one of the neighborhoods and drove down the road to the first house. The road was very bare, no cars parked at the side at all, and most of the houses looked abandoned. Once I got to the first address, I parked on the road and walked up to the front door. A kind old man answered the door and paid for the pizza. I went back and set the directions for the next home. It was in the same neighborhood, sure, but it was taking me much deeper into that neighborhood, to the point where there were less and less houses and more space in between them. By the time I got to the actual address, I couldn't see any other houses around it at all. It was surrounded completely by trees. I parked on the street and walked up to the front door. I knocked on the door and waited patiently on the porch. It was pretty cold out, and the snow was soaking my clothes. That wasn't really helping. Finally, after a minute, the door opened. It was a middle-aged woman who looked like she'd just woken up. Her hair was messy, and she had tired, emotionless eyes. "I have your order here? 2 pizzas?" I said, holding out the boxes and giving her the total to pay. She grabbed the boxes and placed them on the table next to her, then told me to wait a moment for her to get some cash. Another minute went by before the door opened again. She started sifting through the cash, counting it slowly and trying to add it all up. There was definitely something off about her. It was hard to pinpoint exactly what it was, though. but everything she was doing was just odd. As if she wasn't struggling enough with counting the cash, she started up some small talk with me as well. It was fairly normal stuff, how my day was, all that sort of thing. I responded politely. It was really weird though. It looked like she was trying to stall for some reason. While she was talking, I looked back at my car just to distance myself from the uncomfortable situation. I was quick to see a man standing right next to it now. He was looking in the windows and doing something to the door. When I looked back at the woman, her face had shifted to anger. I figured it out all too late though. She reached out and grabbed me, then started yelling to the man by my car. He turned around and started sprinting towards us. The woman tried to pull me into the house, but I pushed her away and broke free. My instincts took hold of me, and I sprinted off into the trees. I could hear the man's heavy footsteps crunching in the snow behind me, all the way through the forest until they started to fade away. After 2 minutes of sprinting, I stopped to catch my breath. Luckily, the moon was lighting up the forest enough for me to navigate through it and back to one of the streets in the neighborhood. I called 911 once I was able to, and after 10 minutes of waiting in the cold, an officer arrived. Another patrol went to the house, finding the man outside in the act of trying to break into my car. To keep things from dragging on, basically the motive was due to the couple running out of money and resorting to robbing my vehicle. The whole distraction was so the man could rob my car without me ever knowing, but since I caught him in the middle of it, it's not really clear what they would have done to me. Maybe they would have just let me go, but it's obvious I would have reported them, so I don't think it's likely they would have. I'm just thankful for getting away unharmed, and for being the first victim they tried it on before being arrested. They'll never have the chance to do anything like that to anyone else. This happened like 12 years ago. I was 14 and my sister was 12. It was during summer vacation. We were hanging out, just the two of us outside, midday. We lived in a smallish town, where during the weekdays it was pretty empty because adults were all at work. Anyway, we'd just been messing around, picking flowers and doing some other random crap, when we decided to cut through a massive field of undeveloped land on the edge of our suburb. It was technically a shortcut to get home, but it wasn't the best idea. It was really bumpy, potted land that other kids and teens had left all sorts of shit laying in. Well, our bad decision came back around and bit us. We hadn't even made it very far into the field when my sister got two bad things at once. Some sort of twisted metal, perhaps an old piece of a tool, had pierced right through her foam flip-flop and into her foot. Right after this happened, she shrieked, jerked, and twisted that ankle on uneven ground. She started crying and howling. Of course, I was worried. The metal hadn't gone too deep, thankfully, and I was able to stop the bleeding with the hem of my shirt, but she couldn't walk anymore, obviously. Our parents weren't available, didn't know where we were, and this was before I had a cell phone. Well, crap. My sister was still on the ground crying. I was trying to calm her down when something made me feel the need to look up. It was the feeling of us being watched. Out in the field across the road, standing on the corner in the distance, was a random guy watching us. He was too far away for me to see him clearly. All I could tell for sure was that he was blonde and adult, and dressed way too warmly for July. He was all alone, stood stock still just staring at us. I've always been a skittish horse, so I looked back at my sister and said to get on my back. I was carrying her home and we were leaving right now. I had to carefully pick my way through this stupid field in my own crappy flip-flops, with my crying sister on my back. Luckily, she was tiny. I wasn't exactly a linebacker myself. It had rained a couple of days ago, and the field had puddles of slimy water in the low spots. We were both wet and soaking from her falling when she got hurt. I swiveled back to check if the man was still watching us, and he was. Not only was he still watching us, he'd crossed the road and was entering the field. He was now standing stock still again, just watching. Ice in the veins doesn't even describe it. One of the scariest moments of my life up to that point. My sister looked when I looked, saw my face, and started crying even harder. I shook her a bit on my back and whispered something like, "Stop it. I need to concentrate on getting us home. Watch him and tell me if he starts following again." So that's what we did. I started walking as fast as I could without getting hurt. My sister watched him while I carried her. After a minute, she started whispering to me that he was moving again. "How fast?" "Just walking." "Is he watching us?" "Yes." I told her to tell me if anything changed and kept going. I stomped through puddles I couldn't see into when I had to, hoping there was nothing sharp in them. I lost a flip-flop in the mud, but I just kept going. We were about 3/4 of the way through the massive field when my sister whispered what I least wanted to hear. He was chasing us. I turned us right around so we were facing him head on and yelled as loud as I could, "Hey, we see you! Fuck off and leave us alone or I'll call the cops!" There was no response. He stopped when I stopped, but gave no sign of acknowledging he'd heard me. I turned around again and kept going. My sister was shaking like a leaf, just saying my name over and over again. It was awful, but there was nothing I could do but to keep going. He started following again, this time at a slower pace. I finally made it to our suburb and out of the muddy field, on to solid concrete. I told my sister to hold on as tight as she could, and I booked it. I was running with her on my back as fast as I could manage. We couldn't see the man anymore. We didn't know what he was doing or where he was. I was going to make it to our house or die trying. Every muscle hurt from carrying her so far. My bare foot was all busted up from the road, but I didn't stop. I kept moving with my sister looking behind us. It felt like my heart was going to burst. The fear and suspense was awful. After what felt like forever, I made it to our house, ran across the yard, up the drive, put down my sister who'd started crying again. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely use my key. We made it in safely and called my mom. She had us lock every door and window and came rushing home, but nothing happened after. The man never found us, and we never saw him again after that. And that's the end. I have no idea who he was or why he was following us like that, but it gives me chills to this day. The way he'd stop when I stopped, the way he ignored my yelling, I don't know what he wanted or what he was doing, and I don't ever want to know. This was just last winter in early February. I was driving to my next DoorDash order. I was a bit tired as I'd been driving for the last 4 hours, and it was almost 12 a.m. After this one, I was definitely calling it a night and heading home. I was worried about getting sleepy on the road, especially with all the ice and snow around. I was driving down a fairly empty road. It was a side road that connected 2 of the main towns in our city. There was a 5-meter stretch, though, that had no buildings or houses anywhere. As I was driving down this section, I don't really know what happened. I just got hit with a sudden wave of tiredness that made me lose focus on the road for just a few seconds. That was all it took, though. I guess I hit a patch of ice and slid toward the side. Although I fully woke back up at this point, it was too far gone. I tried to steer back onto the road, but my car slid straight off and into the small ditch between the road and the woods. Thankfully, it wasn't a bad crash at all, since the snow really lightened the impact. It still made me shaky, though. I knew right away it was going to be impossible to get out of this. My car was stuck on the incline of the ditch in thick snow. I didn't even bother getting out to try and see how bad it was. I did test my luck trying to maneuver the car to get some traction, but if anything, that just made it worse. In the middle of trying to figure everything out, I noticed a car's headlights down the road. At first, I thought it was just a car passing by, but after a few seconds, it was clear they weren't moving. Someone must have just been parked down the road with their headlights on. I found that to be a little bit unnerving. What were the chances of this being on this long, empty road? They weren't close enough to have stopped to try and help me, but they weren't far enough either to not see my headlights. I pulled out my phone and called my dad, knowing he'd still be awake and hoping he'd be able to help me. I'd never been in a situation like this, so I didn't really know what to do. He said he would call roadside assistance, then drive down to wait with me. I thanked him and felt relief, knowing he would be down here in just a few minutes. I looked back out on the road, looking for the headlights from the car I'd just seen, but suddenly they were gone. It was too dark to see anything that far without lights, so I didn't know if they'd driven away or if they were still there just waiting and had turned the lights off. It really started to creep me out the more I thought about it. I kept my eyes down the road, not looking away for more than a few seconds. I began getting very paranoid. There was something about the silence as well that made it more uneasy, only hearing the wind outside my car and nothing else. After 3 minutes of waiting, I saw a figure walking toward my car out of the darkness. He was down the road, coming from the direction where the headlights had been. I watched as he slowly made his way through the snow, getting to just 15 feet away from the front of my car. He then stopped and stood there, facing me but not moving. I couldn't see much of him, as he had a hoodie covering his face, but the way he stood there in my headlights started to terrify me. After a moment, I honked my horn softly a few times, just to let them know I was in the car and I could see them. They didn't move or acknowledge me. Just as I was pulling out my phone to call my dad again, the man turned around and walked away, disappearing down the road. I still called my father to let him know about this really strange person that was out here. He said he was just a minute away. I stayed on the phone with him this time, and only 30 seconds later, I saw headlights turn on down the road and begin moving toward my car. Once they were right across from me, they parked and turned off their lights once more. I couldn't see over the ditch, but I heard a door open. I yelled through my phone what was going on. Just then, my dad's car pulled right in front of my view and screeched to a stop. I heard him yelling at someone. They got back in their car and sped away. They did not come back. My dad said the guy had been holding something in his hands. It looked like a crowbar or something he was going to use to break into my car. Everything went okay after that though, and the car ended up not even having much damage to it. I'm not sure what was about to happen that night, but I'm lucky my dad pulled up exactly when he did. When I was 10, my family moved into a new neighborhood. The first person we met lived just across the street, Millie. Not her real name, obviously. She was a nice elderly lady who was always out on her porch swing with her cats. She told us she was a widow and a grandmother who had lived in that same house for 40 years now. She was excited to have kids, being my sister and I, out on the block and playing again. She just seemed like a lonely old lady and gave off no red flags, nor did she show any strange behavior. One afternoon, a week or two after first moving in, my mom and I were unpacking some boxes when we heard terrified screaming from across the street. I ran outside to see what was going on, while my mom called the police. I saw two women who I'd never seen before running out of Millie's house. One was bleeding from her arm and hand and screaming for help. Millie came out of the door, yelling at them to get out of her house over and over, holding a bloody kitchen knife. Terrified, I ran inside crying. The police arrived and took both women away, leaving us to wonder what exactly was going on here. A few days later, my mom met the stabbed woman, Holly. She explained what exactly had happened. It turned out Millie had never lived in that house, and the cats she loved so much were really Holly's. Millie had been sitting on Holly's porch during the day while Holly was away at work for several months on end. At some point, she found a spare key Holly kept hidden in her garden and had been going into the house during the day, leaving before Holly returned. Holly had begun to notice things were off in her home, but didn't think much of it at first. On the day of her attack, Holly happened to come home early and find Millie in her kitchen. Millie screamed and went after her with the knife, demanding she get out of her house. Millie was deeply mentally ill and had the delusion that everything in that house was hers. The police had told Holly she seemed particularly attached to the cats. Perhaps her connection to them triggered these deep delusions. Remembering this story now, I always feel a mix of sadness and being creeped out. Holly moved away a year or two after the incident. It's a mystery what happened to Millie. If she got help, was put in an institution, prison, taken by her family, I guess we'll never know. I do Uber Eats on the weekends, and sometimes on days when school is out. This happened just a couple of weeks before our school's holiday break. It was a Friday night, and I didn't have any plans at all. I figured, why not make a few extra bucks instead of being bored and laying around the house all day long. I started driving, set up the app to start getting orders. It wasn't really snowing out, but it was really cold and windy. There was still a thin layer of snow on the roads from earlier that day. I think it was around 6 p.m. or so when I started. I did a few orders before I got one to pick up from a nearby Burger King. Once I got the food, I checked on the app where I was going. It was clear at a first glance that this wasn't a real house address. When I zoomed in a little bit more, I was confused to see it was at the corner of two streets, looking like maybe a gas station. Although finding it to be unusual, I clicked begin route and started driving over. I didn't think it was anything bad. I just thought it was going to be an awkward interaction, since I'd probably have to find the person in the parking lot and give it to them directly. Usually, I'd never even see the customers. I just do a quick drop-off. As I got closer and drove up to the intersection it was at, I saw that it was indeed a gas station. That was right in the spot the directions were taking me to. The gas station itself looked normal, but there were no cars in the parking lot. I pulled in and parked in one of the spots at the back, then stayed in my car. I tried to look around for anyone. The app should have let them know that I'd arrived, so I was expecting someone to be out there waiting for me. Even after a couple of minutes though, I didn't see anybody around here. I sent a text through the app just letting them know I was in the parking lot, waiting for them to come get their food. I got out of my car to see if I could get a better look around. The whole intersection was empty. No cars were passing by. All the stores on the street seemed to be closed for the night. The longer I stood out there, the more unsettled I became. I checked my phone, still seeing no response from the customer. I was just about to get back into my car when a truck pulled into the gas station. They passed the pumps and drove right up to me, parking just a couple of spots away. It was an older, dark red pickup with tinted windows. The first thought to come through my head was, why would they order a delivery if they were going to end up driving there anyway? I thought initially that maybe it was a worker at the gas station or somebody just hanging out here, but now this was way more suspicious than it already was. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out of the truck. From one look at him, I could see he had a very disheveled appearance, like someone you'd expect to see living out on the road. Even his clothes looked dirty, stained, and torn. As he got out, I held up the bag with a slight smile, but the man didn't even look at it. He kept his eyes locked on me. As he approached, something struck me, giving the feeling I needed to get out of there immediately. I set the bag on the ground. Almost immediately, the man started sprinting, as if he knew I was getting ready to leave. I got back in my car and started backing out, just as the man got up to my door. He ran back to his truck, leaving the bag of the food there on the ground. As I left the gas station, I saw him back out quickly and start speeding toward the exit I was leaving from. I floored it, going through a red light and speeding down the road until I got to where more cars were. The truck tried to follow me for a minute or so, but then turned away. Once I was safe, I called the police, but nothing really came of it. In the heat of the moment, I never even thought to check the man's license plate. Thinking back on it, I'm not even sure if he had one. I don't know what he was doing or what would have happened if I didn't leave when I did, but knowing I was that close to finding out is a horrifying thought. It was about, I want to say, 7 to 8 years ago. I was living in an apartment complex doing online college courses while trying to help a friend start up a business. It fell through eventually, but that's neither here or there. It was about 3 a.m. I was still writing a paper when I heard someone pull up to the building and into the parking lot. I looked out to see a truck. Nothing special. I kept on writing. A few moments later, though, I heard a desperate screaming. I looked out, and this lady was next to the truck that just pulled in, screaming and spinning in a circle with the driver's side door open. She's got her hands up near her hair, waving them around. I thought to myself, Wasp must have gotten into the truck or something and she's freaking out. It didn't trip any mental alarms. I saw this guy running up to her and thought, oh, I guess a friend is arriving to help. I turned back and tried to remember where I was in the paper. About a minute later, though, I started hearing a noise I knew very well, metal on concrete. As a kid, when playing baseball in the street, I liked to bash my bat against the street a few times and pretend to swing before having my friend throw the ball. I heard it again over and over. I looked out and noticed the guy was now bashing what looked like a random spot on the concrete behind someone's car. My weird shit alarm was now going off, and without any personal context, I called my roommate to see if he was noticing this too. By the time we got to looking out again, the noise had stopped. We were instead treated to what looked like vehicular vandalism as a car pulled out of a space opposite my building, pulled closer to the cars on my row, and scraped their sides real slow before racing off. I noticed the door to the truck was still open. At this point, I felt compelled to figure out what was going on. Outside, I crawled out as I approached the truck. I saw the prone form of a woman pushed up under it. Once I saw all the blood, it clicked together. Somebody had ambushed her, beat her to death with a blunt metal object, and ran her over for good measure. I had just witnessed someone's brutal murder without even realizing it. I immediately yelled to my roommate to call 911, as he was the only one who had enough sense to bring a phone. I answered a ton of questions to the cops, and even ended up testifying it. Someone on the other side of the building had seen more, but I was apparently the only one to actually go out there to call the cops. It haunted me for months. Sometimes I'd hallucinate a little, thinking I'd see her mutilated body sitting in the back of my car through my mirror. These days, if I hear anything weird going on outside my house, I check or immediately call the cops if it sounds dangerous. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.